Lebavanum Elenik was a princess who was held hostage in the great kingdom of Belgoth. At the same time, she was eagerly awaiting the emperor of the great state. He approached her slowly, and at the same time called out to her. She quickly turned around and ran towards him. Elenik shouted, with a smile, that she had been waiting for him very much. But at the same time, she called him father, with a joyful smile. The emperor looked at her with displeasure. He was puzzled because he did not understand why she called him that, and she was taken aback because she misspoke again. But she noticed that he wasn't angry. She said with a smile that she wanted to talk to him about something else. At that very moment, with a radiant smile, she asked if he would marry her. The emperor was momentarily taken aback by such a question. She looked at him intently and reached out to him. The emperor sighed heavily and said that he had not kidnapped her in order to marry her. At that very moment, she said that she knew about it, but he was puzzled because he did not understand why she asked him about such a thing. She thought for a moment, not knowing what answer to give him to such a question. And at that very moment, she told Sir, with a joyful smile, that she was very much in love with him, and it was love at first sight. But he coldly replied that he did not love her, and she was then taken aback, as she was surprised by his statement. He said with a smile that, as far as she knew, he already had a fiancée. She was taken aback, and said that he himself had said earlier that she was not his fiancée. She knew perfectly well that all his words were false. He thought for a moment, and said that he had to fix this, and officially proposed to her. She smiled and said that she could admit that his future was not predetermined, but she wanted to ask if he loved Lady Hellas. He thought for a moment, not knowing what to answer. She smiled and said that she had the opportunity. The emperor looked at her in bewilderment and asked why he should give her this opportunity. She was taken aback and asked if he liked her. He said with a grin that he didn't think she liked him. She was furious because she said she liked him and said she loved him. She didn't understand what else he wanted. Elenik shouted that if he married her, he would receive much more benefits from the marriage. He smiled and said that she should tell him all the advantages. At that very moment, she listed all the benefits to the emperor. At the same moment, she shouted that if he married her, her father would immediately open the way for Glucoman. The emperor looked at her menacingly and said that even if he did not marry her, he would still open the way. Elenik froze for a moment because she knew he was right. At such moments, she felt sad that her country was a weak kingdom the size of a pea. She understood that if the man knew why she did all this, he would immediately accept her offer because she was just trying to save him. Elenik knew that if he married Hellas, they would have a terrible villain. The young lady will raise her son to be an evil magician, and the emperor will become the father of a villain and die at the hands of his own son before his 40th birthday. She understood that if she said something like that, he would think she was crazy, but she had no other choice. At that very moment, she shouted and asked if she was ugly. There was an awkward pause between them, as the emperor immediately replied that he did not know. She was furious, but at that very moment, he said that it was the first time he had received an offer of this kind, but it sounded quite original. Mocking her, he said that he wanted to say it straight out, because he had no intention of marrying her. He said that he did not want a marriage without love at all. She was shocked because he said that he did not love the lady with whom he wanted to build a marriage. He looked intently at the princess and said that he was now making every effort to love her. The princess was shocked by his statement, as she had expected something different. At that very moment, the emperor said that for this reason he would send her home as soon as the road opened. He smiled and said that their conversation was over, and it was time for him to leave. Elenik looked at him with fury, as she had no intention of giving up. There was a reason why she clung so desperately to the emperor, who rejected her, because she was reincarnated into a novel many years before the main events began. And now she must prevent the birth of the main villain and stop the misfortune that will befall the main characters. And save yourself from a short life of several years, which was cut short due to an excess of mana. The only person who can save her is the descendant of a god, the Emperor of Belgoth Eurydion, but she was puzzled as he decisively refused her. She was angry because her attempts to save everyone began after the villain's humiliating refusal. Elenik looked closely at her sister and asked with a smile what they would name the child. Elenik looked at her sister with a smile because she wanted to know the answer. The princess was a little embarrassed and did not know how to answer her sister's question. At that very moment, she said with a smile that they would name the child Brisny, Elenik froze in shock, as she did not expect this. The princess was a little puzzled, because she knew that the name given was similar to the name of a pet, but her sister assured her that this was not the case. When she heard the name given, everything fell into place. Then she realized that she had entered the world of Brisney's novella and wanted to be happy. She read it before her death. She realized that the main character of the novel was now growing in her older sister's belly. She was shocked because she didn't expect anything like this at all. More than 6 months later, she woke up in a new body and then saw skin as white as snow and light pink hair. Then she clearly saw beautiful blue eyes, clear as the clear sky. She was taken aback as she realized that she had turned into a real beauty and simply could not believe that it was really her. At that very moment, she was taken aback as she heard someone speaking in a strange language. But after a few seconds, she heard a noise and saw a beautiful woman who blinded everyone around her. At that very moment, she heard more people because they were very puzzled by her condition, but at the same time they called her a princess. Jazivia excitedly told the princess that she heard her scream, while the young lady was confused. Then she realized that the girl in front of her was her sister. At that very moment, she saw the maids. She looked timidly at everyone present and asked if they could tell her who she was. She wanted to know where she was, but everyone present was taken aback and froze with stony faces, as they did not expect such a thing. At that very moment, a complete commotion began in the room. They were shouting that the youngest princess had lost her memory. With tears in her eyes, she looked at her daughter and asked if they really didn't remember her. She was in shock as people came running to her, calling her their daughter. She was a little confused and taken aback, as she had never had people she could call her family. At that very moment, she could not bear it and burst into loud tears as she did not understand who she was and where she had ended up. She thought she had died in an accident that was very unexpected. She touched her head to the bus window while reading a novel, but at some point she felt a strong blow and lost consciousness due to shock. And when she woke up, it turned out that it was unclear where it was. This place should be unfamiliar to her, but surprisingly, she had the feeling as if she had often heard about it. After some time, the man came to her and said that his name was Fernandez Cardio and that he would now be her personal security guard. She was taken aback when she heard his name, and then she asked him again what his name was. He looked at her in surprise but still repeated his name. She was excited, as she was sure that she had heard it somewhere. At that very moment, the young princess was dumbfounded as she remembered the novella. She smiled and said that this simply couldn't be true, and that she had made it all up. She smiled and said that it seemed like her imagination was just running wild. The princess was puzzled because she had heard this name in a novel. Elenik sighed heavily and asked the young man if he had a son or a brother. She knew only one Cardio. He was the main character of the novella she read before her death, a knight whose incredible beauty made her heart flutter. He smiled and said that he was not yet married and was the only child in the family. She was taken aback because she realized that his words were very familiar, and at that moment, she realized that she had actually found herself in a novella. She sighed heavily as she knew that the main characters had not yet been born. He looked at her puzzledly and asked if everything was okay with her. Elenik was taken aback as she remembered the cheese at the moment she started reading the novella. It was only now that she realized that the novella began with the kidnapping of her pregnant sister. Elenik sighed heavily as she realized that, unfortunately, she would soon be kidnapped by the emperor. She was aware of the fact that she was now only in the prologue of a cruel story. Elenik was furious and simply understood that this could not happen. She sighed heavily because she knew that it was pointless that she was in someone else's body. She knew that a huge empire which could destroy her kingdom with one blow was located next to them. In the new alley, it was the great ruler of the empire who kidnapped her older sister. He suddenly attacked them and kidnapped the princess and then kept her in captivity. She was scared because she knew he was just a nasty man. She understood that if one got to know him better, one could understand that he was after all an unhappy man who would ultimately meet a tragic death. But she was puzzled by everything that was happening, and so when she read and found out that he had died, she cried her eyes out. But now she was in a different situation, and she was very scared. She feared him as he was the ruler of a powerful empire, but be that as it may, the kidnapping of her older sister was only the prologue of the story. The story began with an unusual love between a princess and her guard, and the novel had several main characters, the princess and her guard, and also the main villain and tyrant emperor. The story was about how the main characters helped each other, and they shot at childhood traumas and corrected the tragedies of the past. It could be said that none of the main characters' parents had a calm and happy life. She was puzzled because she knew that they all died very early. After the kidnapping, the time for a quiet and measured life passed. Brisney's father, Duke Levanon, went to rescue his pregnant wife and died during the battle. The princess learned the sad news when she was in a foreign country, and from the shock she experienced, she gave birth. But unfortunately, she gave birth to a girl a few weeks before the due date. After this, the kingdom and the empire never ended the truce, and only 10 years later were they able to return home. Due to the loss of Brisney's sorrow and anger, corroded Descartes' heart, so he became a villain who gained the ability to control the souls of hell. So after Brisney's departure, the prince sacrificed his own father to black magic, and in order to become emperor himself, he absorbed the kingdom where the girl was. The young lady was puzzled, as she knew that the emperor was just a poor man, but she still knew that he was scary, because he had done a lot of bad things. Unfortunately, she also knew that a few years after returning to her homeland, the princess died of an infectious disease. She was puzzled as she understood that many deaths were in the young girl's path. She also knew that the protagonist's father, who was also her bodyguard, lost a leg and an eye during the war. Now she was sure that the original story was about the healing power of youth and sweet love. But she understood that if the story turned out like in the novel, then a sad ending awaited them. It was amazing, but it became reality, and at the very beginning, she did not want to accept this reality. Elenik now understood that she had no choice, because this was her next life, and she assumed that the emperor would soon attack them. The princess smiled and asked her sister what she was thinking about. She looked at her sister with a smile and said that she looked funny. Elenik was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. But a moment later, with her joyful smile, she said that she was simply happy that she would soon be able to see the new addition to their family. Elenika, in turn, understood perfectly well that she had to cope since she was familiar with the novella, and therefore she wanted to correct all the tragedies. She understood perfectly well that she had to prevent all the impending tragedies at any cost. She wanted to start with cause and effect. She didn't know why the empire attacked her kingdom. She was puzzled because from the first line, she had a problem. She remembered that the kingdom refused to follow the agreement, and the empire was angry with them. She sighed heavily, as she did not know what her agreement was about. At that very moment, the young man asked his mistress what was troubling her, as she looked unwell. She stood frozen for a moment, not knowing what to answer. Sighing heavily, she said she was worried about his right leg and left eye. The young man looked at her in bewilderment, because he did not understand what she was talking about. Elenik waved him off and said that it didn't matter at all now. She understood that he wouldn't be able to understand her anyway. But a moment later, she called him anyway. And at that very moment, she asked if their kingdom had signed any agreement with the empire. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really meant the Glucoman agreement. At that moment, the young lady was taken aback and looked at him in surprise. He said that it was a matter of an agreement according to which they would open the road and the empire in turn would send the mana stones to itself. Elenik understood at that very moment that something similar was said in the novella. She was momentarily taken aback and wondered who had broken the agreement first. She assumed it was her father. She was furious because she knew they definitely needed to get their broken agreement back. Fernandez looked at the princess in surprise and asked where she was going, but she did not answer. She understood perfectly well that she had to become a secret hero who would save the kingdom. At that very moment, she burst into her father's room. He greeted her with a smile. He asked with a smile if something urgent had happened, and at that very moment, he was taken aback as she wanted to talk about the agreement. She knew her father had a weakness for her cute expressions, so she had to show off her charm. At that very moment, she asked again about the Glucoman agreement. The king was taken aback and looked away from her. He didn't understand why his youngest daughter needed to know about all the international affairs. She was shocked and didn't understand what kind of show he was putting on. Elenik looked closely at her father and asked if he had anything strange in mind. He was taken aback and asked what she was talking about. She was furious because she realized that she had arrived too late. Elenik froze in shock when she heard the story from her father. She asked her father angrily if he had really closed the road several years ago. The king looked away, not knowing how to talk to her. Initially, the empire was a country without manna stones, but since they needed them to protect the palace of their borders, they entered into a trade agreement with the kingdom that possessed the stones. So the empire is in the east, but in the agreement they were given permission to use the road as the shortest route, which was in the west. Recently, huge reserves of stones were discovered in the mine, so trade activity between the countries skyrocketed. And when this happened, greed got the better of her father, so he wanted to change the terms of the contract a little. After the young lady heard the terms of the contract, she thought that her father was a simple robber. She asked angrily if he was afraid of the empire, since he himself had closed the road for several years. He smiled and assured her that such a thing would never happen. The empire would not harm them. She was furious because she knew it was he who had destroyed the peace on the continent. She screamed at him to open the way, but he said he had no reason to. Elenik was puzzled because she hadn't even started yet, but she had already lost the fight. Jazivia looked at her sister with concern, as she was lost in her thoughts. She asked her sister what she was so worried about. The princess said with a smile that everything was fine, she didn't need to worry. Jazivia spoke of his sister, that she should share everything with her. Jazivia smiled and said that if something wrong happened, she would do everything possible to help. At that very moment, Elenik came to her sister and shouted that she would protect her. She understood perfectly well that if she couldn't stop the invasion, she had to prevent her sister's kidnapping. Then she was taken aback and wondered when the empire was going to attack them. Sometime later, she visited her best friend Sergei, who was also the younger brother of the Duke of Levanon. He asked why she left the palace and came to him. She smiled and asked if he knew her deep thoughts. He mockingly asked if she really knew how to think deeply. She was furious with such a question, and so she quickly rebuffed him. She was furious because she knew that when the empire invaded the country, she had to be there for her sister. But she knew that it was impossible to keep a married sister in the palace. Sergei shouted at the young lady that she was still the same, but had become more uncontrollable. She was puzzled because those close to her did not notice her changes. But she was glad about this since her character was similar to that of a real princess. But she was puzzled by everything that was happening. She understood perfectly well that if she had known that something like this would happen to her, she would have read everything carefully. Sergei looked at her worriedly and asked if something had happened to her. She sighed heavily as she understood that she would not be able to answer his question. But a moment later, she did say that something had happened to her. She looked at him intently and said that he must come and save her at the right moment. Sergei looked at her in surprise because he did not understand why he should save her, since she already had a knight. Elenik said with a grin that he himself would run to save her. She knew that's exactly how it happened in the original. She sighed heavily as she understood that this was a very important scene for her characters. But now she realized that she simply had to take her sister to a safe place beforehand. She knew she would do it, and at that very moment, she told her friend that she trusted only him. He sighed heavily and said that she was saying strange things again. But the young lady only looked at him with a smile and did not answer. And to her regret, she was not thinking at all about the emperor's goals then. And then she couldn't even imagine that in the princess kingdom, there was not only her older sister. Sometime later, the young lady sat quietly sipping tea with her family. But to her regret, she was very nervous, as she had been on edge for the last few days. Today, for some reason, she was more nervous than usual. At that very moment, she stood up and told her sister that she could not stay outside for long. The princess was a little puzzled by her sister's behavior. Elnik was serious and told her sister that she had had enough. The king and queen looked at her in bewilderment, as they did not understand what was happening to her. Elnik smiled and said that lately her sister had been tired of short walks. When she came home, she was surprised. Besides, the young lady said that it was already too cold outside and they needed to go. But after a few minutes, she heard a noise and realized that they were under attack, but she also understood that she had to pull herself together. At that very moment, she grabbed her sister by the hand and dragged her into the palace. She was puzzled because she knew she had to hide her sister quickly. Elenik found a wonderful place for her sister to hide. She thought for a moment, knowing that her niece had discovered this loophole. Elenik told his sister that she would climb inside and upon descending would find herself in the basement. Then she realized that several people would not fit there. She shouted to her sister that she should sit quietly and not stick her head out. The princess was shocked. She wanted her sister to explain what was going on. At that very moment, Elenique, covering her sister, said that they would see each other soon. She looked at her sister with a smile and said that she should think only about the child. Elenique knew she had to hurry before the imperial troops entered. Elenique quietly said to his sister, gave something she should watch everything that was happening through the crack, but sit quietly. She smiled and said that they would meet soon. When the young princess came out, she froze in place as she realized that the imperial knights were already right in front of her. She was shocked as she saw the knights fighting. She was taken aback because she understood that this was no longer a joke. Elenique was very scared because she understood that everything that was happening was much more terrible than she imagined. Elenique knew she had to get to the next hole, but the princess also understood that this place was very far away. Then she thought for a moment because she didn't know whether she should leave. She remembered that Sergei knew where she was now and hoped that he would still save her. Elenique sighed heavily as she realized that she had destroyed the original and now she had to fix the situation herself. Looking around, she realized that there was no one around, and at that very moment she began to walk quietly. But at the same time, the emperor was closely watching the battle. A few seconds later, he caught a glimpse of a young lady running away in a hurry. Then he saw her beautiful hair. At the same time, the princess looked around, as she hoped that no one noticed her. But at that very moment, she froze as she realized that a menacing gaze was directed at her. Frightened, she quickly hid behind a large pendant. She was in shock. She didn't understand what had happened at all. She wondered how long ago he had noticed her. She sat quietly behind the column and trembled with fear, but she hoped that he would leave soon. She covered her mouth with her hand so as not to breathe too loudly, and in her thoughts she asked Sergei to hurry. Elenique looked around as she felt someone's presence and froze in place. At that very moment, she clearly saw red eyes and silver hair in front of her. The emperor reached out to her with a grin as he caught the princess. She was furious as she realized that Sergei was a scoundrel. The young princess was puzzled as she knew she was in trouble. She was a little lost as she didn't understand why, out of the blue, she had been turned over. At that very moment, the knights rushed to the princess and told the emperor to release her immediately. But the emperor, with lightning speed, began to scatter the knights throughout the kingdom, and his faithful knights rushed to him. He sighed heavily as they were very annoying. In turn, the young lady screamed because these actions made her feel sick. A few minutes later, she heard Sergei's voice. The man screamed and called for his girlfriend, but it was all in vain. At that very moment, she shouted to him because she did not understand where she had been at all since she had been captured by a terrible man. But the emperor had no intention of giving up. He dealt with all his opponents with lightning speed. The young princess burst into tears and could not utter a word. At that very moment, she asked the emperor for forgiveness and muttered something. With tears in her eyes, she sighed heavily and asked if he could let her go. The emperor looked at her in bewilderment and asked if she was really asking to be released. She screamed that she wanted him to just put her down on the ground. She screamed that it hurt because his armor was cutting into her body. At that very moment, she was taken aback as he easily pulled her back. Elenique froze in place in surprise when she saw that she was already sitting on the horse. Helenica screamed at the emperor that he should just let her go because she was very afraid. But at that very moment, the emperor calmed her down and asked her to straighten her back. He sighed heavily and said that she was doing everything right. A moment later, he informed the entire army that they were to set out. At that very moment, all the knights surrounded him, and after a few seconds, he gave the horse a signal, and a moment later, they set off on their way. After some time, the young lady closed her eyes as she clearly saw a magic circle. She was puzzled because he was blinding her, but the emperor covered her eyes. After some time, she heard some noise and slowly opened her eyes. The princess was puzzled as there was a loud buzzing in her head. The emperor sighed heavily as he saw that the princess had finally woken up. Elenique looked at the emperor with a satisfied smile as he was a handsome man. He was puzzled and did not understand what was wrong with her. The magician told the emperor that she needed a thorough examination. A few minutes later, the man approached the princess and asked her forgiveness for the subsequent liberties on his part. At that very moment, he used his power on her, but after a few seconds, she clearly felt dizzy. She was puzzled and wondered if such severe pain was due to motion sickness. At that very moment, the man touched her, and she fell with a crash, as she felt as if her head was exploding. She reached out to someone and froze for a moment. She was in shock, because for some reason the pain subsided, but in front of her she saw the emperor. He looked at the princess with fear, and asked if everything was okay with her, as she had also grabbed his legs. With tears in her eyes, the princess said that she was fine. But in turn, she was worried, because she did not understand what was happening to her at all. And besides, she had experienced a lot in the last few days. She burst into tears, because she knew she had been through a lot, but she knew that even if she had known about it all beforehand, she would have still done the same thing. Elenik in turn screamed that he did not grab her sister and should have just left. She did not understand why he took her. She was in shock. She didn't understand why, out of everything that was around her, she grabbed his leg. At that very moment, the emperor lifted the princess up and looked intently into her eyes. She froze for a moment, looking at the emperor, as he was dazzlingly handsome. But she did not stop crying. The emperor looked at her in bewilderment and asked why she was so sad. Elenik was in shock and didn't even know what to answer. But after a few seconds, she was already sitting on the imperial flag and was very surprised by this fact. The emperor wiped away her tears and asked her for forgiveness, as he did not know that she was sensitive to manna. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed that she was greenly frightened by the unexpected abduction. She sighed heavily, feeling disgraced after the way he had courted her. Elenik was puzzled and did not understand what kind of pain she had felt earlier, because now she felt nothing. The emperor looked at her closely and asked if she had always been sensitive to manna and magic stones. The young lady was taken aback and didn't know what to answer. He looked at her with surprise and menace and asked if she really didn't know. The young lady with tears in her eyes said that this had never happened to her before. The emperor looked closely at the magician and asked what had happened to the young lady. Roselle informed the emperor that such a reaction was not surprising, since the young lady was sensitive to manna. But the emperor didn't understand why she didn't know about it. The man said that he could have guessed something like that since she grew up in conditions where she was never exposed to manna. But the emperor was puzzled because he did not understand why she suddenly felt better. But the man could not answer this question. He said that if they watched the princess closely, they might find the answer. The emperor sighed heavily and said that, in that case, they could no longer use the magic circle. He informed everyone that they had already crossed the border and would continue to travel on horses. He sighed heavily, and looking at the princess asked if she was also not used to horses. At that very moment, she shouted that she could ride a horse, but he noticed that for someone who made such claims, she looked too scared. Elenik said embarrassedly that it was difficult for her to travel alone. She was taken aback and realized that she shouldn't be nervous about something like this, because he had kidnapped her, and the emperor had said that she would go with him. He said that if they traveled all day, they could be there the day after tomorrow. She sighed heavily, as she always felt that he was too kind to be a kidnapper. She sat up and thanked him, but a moment later, the princess looked intently at the emperor. At that very moment, she asked if he was going to send her back to the kingdom. The emperor stood frozen for a moment, not knowing what to answer. At that very moment, she looked at him with tears in her eyes. She sighed heavily, as she knew that no matter how kind he was in the original novel, he had kept her sister in captivity for a long time. The emperor looked intently at the young princess, and at the same moment he said that if the negotiations ended successfully, he would take care of her safety. She looked closely at the emperor, for she knew at what age he would be brutally killed by his own son. She exhaled because she understood that this was a unique thing, namely the feeling that a person experiences when he knows the end of another person's life. The emperor asked if he could count on her assistance until then. He looked at her with a smile and said that it would be impossible, considering that his words sounded like a threat. She was taken aback when she realized that she didn't even know the man's name. At that very moment, she called him, but at the same time called him Mr. Father. He looked at her in surprise. Elenik hastily asked the emperor his name. He was taken aback for a moment and froze, but after a few seconds he gave his full name. She smiled and said that he probably already knew, but she introduced herself and gave her full name anyway. At the same moment, she said with a smile that she was very pleased to meet him. The emperor was taken aback for a moment, as he had not expected such a thing, but said that he was also pleased to meet her. Some time later, as they were returning to the empire on horseback, The emperor asked the princess to relax a little. He said that if she behaved like this, her back would hurt. She screamed that this was not true. It did not hurt at all. She was confused since he took off the armor because she said it hurt. But now that the armor was gone, their bodies were very close. She was very embarrassed as she had never experienced such closeness with a man before. She noticed that he was not at all the way, and it seemed to her that she felt better only because she was inhaling his pure aroma. The princess felt as if she was gaining energy when she was near him, but she still recoiled from the emperor as she was ashamed of her behavior. Filled with embarrassment, she wondered if she was one of those shameless women. But at that very moment, to her regret, she realized that she had begun to fall. The emperor reacted quickly and grabbed her. He looked at her with fear and asked her to sit still. The princess agreed with him in a strangled voice. She was puzzled as everything that was happening really confused her. A few hours later, she felt ill again. She was puzzled and ashamed that something like this had happened to her. Everyone was confused and didn't understand what they needed to do. She was shocked because she was just watching the great master light a fire with magic. Elenik crawled towards the emperor with all her strength as she understood that now was not the time to be embarrassed about being touched. She moved closer and closer to him and inhaled his fresh scent, and then she felt that her suffering had ceased. The emperor hastily embraced her, but still asked the magician if she was too sensitive. The man was taken aback as he had only lit the fire using magic. She was puzzled as this had happened more than once. She felt sick when they passed through the circle, when they used magic on her to heal, and when they lit the fire. The man sighed heavily as he noticed that the princess had an intolerance to magic. Everyone was surprised by this fact, but the magician said that this was a very rare feature, but sometimes such people were born. He was worried because he realized that this was a much more serious problem. The young princess was puzzled as she knew that she was in a world where magic existed. She was not affected by it, and this could only be explained by the fact that she was not from this world. The emperor looked at the man and asked him to avoid using magic as she was very sensitive. She was in shock. She did not understand why. When she felt strong and sharp pain, she touched the emperor, and she immediately felt better. At that very moment, he asked the princess if something similar had happened to her in the kingdom. She was taken aback for a moment, as it was difficult for her to answer such a question, since this was her first encounter with magic. She simply could not believe that after the abduction, she was being taken to a country where there was magic. Elenik, with tears in her eyes, screamed at the emperor that it would be better if he simply knocked her out. He looked at her in bewilderment. She said that if he had just hit her on the back of the head, she would have lost consciousness, and then they would have reached the palace faster. He was surprised because she said he had to harm her. The princess smiled and said that it would be faster that way. The emperor said he considered it unacceptable to raise a hand against a member of another country's royal family. She screamed that the knights were injured, and unfortunately, they could not light a fire and cook food or heal wounds. She said she couldn't limit them. She said that if he wanted to do it with his own hands, he could use magic. He was worried that something might go wrong. Elenik smiled and said that if he hugged her, she would feel better. She didn't say this because she had any personal interests. He sighed heavily because he knew that it was not difficult. Still, he refused looking at everyone present. He said that he asked her for assistance, not for sacrifice. The emperor asked her to close this matter and not to raise this topic again. He slowly wrapped her in his cloak and asked her not to go far from him. Elenik looked at him with tears in her eyes, as she was touched by his concern. With tears in her eyes, she said that she would definitely save him, but at the same time, she again let it slip and called him Mr. Father. He was puzzled and didn't understand why she kept calling him that, but she didn't pay attention to his question. Elenik was puzzled by everything that was happening, but she knew that when she was near him, she felt better. They moved away to a safe distance, but unfortunately, the magician informed the emperor that he did not know how to cure the princess's illness. He heard that people with mana intolerance do not live longer than 5 years from the moment of birth. Elenik was taken aback and froze in place from shock. At that very moment, she jumped up and asked the man if he had really just said that she would only live for 5 years. Roselle sighed heavily and said that it was true because a person cannot avoid mana all his life. She was shocked because he reported that mana had permeated the earth and the air they breathed. He said it was natural that people with mana intolerance did not live long. She was shocked because she realized that she had only reached such an age, because the body in this body was not that of a real princess. She realized that she had little time left. The emperor looked at her in surprise. She was furious because she realized that she was doomed, and she did not understand why you were doing this to her. The emperor saw that she was furious, and at that very moment he sat her down next to him and asked her to calm down. Roussel said that it could be assumed that in a gesture to the essence of the emperor, the destructive influence of manna was counteracted. The emperor was a little surprised, but everything sounded quite plausible. She remembered that in this world there were gods, and at that very moment she began to remember the history of the world. She knew that the emperor was related by blood to the god of peace and prosperity, which meant that he was a true descendant of the god. Roussel told the emperor that if he stayed close to the princess, everything would be fine with her. At that very moment, she listened to all the stories with inspiration because she realized that the emperor could save her. Roussel asked the princess if she had ever received God's blessing. The emperor asked if she had been baptized. She was taken aback, as she had not known anything like that. She knew that her sister, as soon as she found out she was pregnant, immediately received a blessing for the child. She was sure that she had also received a blessing. The emperor doubted her answer, because she was not sure. In this world, revealing one's baptismal name to anyone other than one's parents and spouse was considered a desecration of the name. Eurydion sighed heavily and said that she should be forgiven. Roussel smiled and said that it seemed so, since the princess had lived to such an age, and therefore she was protected by the gods. The princess looked at them with a smile as she understood that the magician's guilt was not here. She understood that she was the only one to blame because she came from another world. She was deep in thought for a while. Elenik assumed that she had an intolerance to magic because she was from another world. She was confused because she knew that her plan had completely failed since she had been kidnapped, not her sister. But she knew that the main problem now was her life, so she didn't need to worry about other people. She couldn't even imagine that her savior would be a minor character doomed to a miserable death. The emperor looked at her in surprise as he saw that she was immersed in her thoughts. But at that very moment, a very interesting idea crept into the young princess's head. She knew that her life depended only on the emperor, and therefore she had to always be near him. Elenik raised that she had to protect him, but in this way, his son should not study dark magic. She knew that the boy had learned dark magic from his mother. Elenik understood that she had to prevent this from happening. She wondered if he should have married that woman in the first place. At that very moment, she realized that he could marry her. The emperor looked at her intently and called out, and at that very moment she screamed as she was deeply immersed in her thoughts. She was puzzled, and she understood that thinking about the person who was next to her was too careless, but she realized that this plan was simply perfect. The next day, the young princess looked at the emperor with a joyful smile. She understood that if she married a kind, gentle, and handsome man, her life would improve, but she knew that this was just her fantasy, but she wanted it to last forever. Eurydion looked at her with a tender smile and asked what she was thinking about so intently. She smiled and said that he was very handsome, and she was thinking about marrying him. At that very moment, the emperor froze in place from shock. But at that very moment, her thoughts about marriage vanished. She froze for a moment, not understanding why he was looking at her so intently and strangely. Memories of yesterday flashed before her like a panorama. Elenik was puzzled as she realized that she had behaved a little shamelessly yesterday, but she knew that it had not been that bad. The young princess sighed heavily as she realized she needed to stop thinking about things like that. The emperor looked at her intently, and at that very moment said that she was quite an unusual person. The young princess was in shock as she experienced a very strong shame. She realized that she was wrong when she assumed that she could marry him. She understood that he would have no reason to marry a princess from a small country anyway. At that moment, she looked at him in surprise as he called her. He sighed heavily, and holding out his hand, asked her to come to him. She was taken aback and slowly walked towards him, but at the same time she was lost, as she was ashamed of her actions. The emperor in turn easily lifted her up and looked intently into her eyes. At that very moment, he put her on the horse with the same ease. She sighed heavily, as she was already beginning to get used to this. The emperor, looking at everyone present, shouted that it was time for them to set out, because by this evening they should already be in the capital, so he asked them to give it their all. Elenik understood perfectly well that even if she couldn't marry him, she couldn't allow him to marry a dark witch. After all, according to the plot, the dark witch with a fierce grin told her son that he was the fruit of the most powerful divine energy and the darkest manna. She looked at him with admiration and said with pleasure that he could have everything he wanted. The young witch was glad that she had a son who wielded crushing power. The young lady in turn wondered what it would be like to hold in his hands the power with which he could shake the world. Now she understood that it was because of the woman that the boy himself began to deteriorate. She was furious because she understood that the young lady had shown her son the world of black magic, and therefore she assumed that she was out of her mind. She understood that she had to stop their wedding, but at that very moment she was taken aback, because she did not know when the emperor was supposed to get married. She knew that her niece was due in a few months. Having calculated everything, she realized that the emperor's son was a year younger than her niece. She was shocked because she realized that according to the most daring calculations, she only had a year for everything. At that very moment, the young princess called the emperor. She was a little puzzled because she did not know how to ask him such a question. He looked at her with bewilderment as he saw that she wanted to ask something. Helenica gathered her courage, shouted, and asked the emperor whether he was married or already expecting a child. The emperor was taken aback by such questions. At that moment, he couldn't resist laughing. She was a little puzzled, as she knew that these questions sounded stupid, and she knew it herself. The emperor smiled and said that he was not married yet. She was surprised. He smiled and said that she didn't need to worry, because he didn't have children, and wouldn't have any anytime soon. The princess thought for a moment, as she realized that this was very good. He sighed heavily and said that she was constantly asking strange questions, and rather unexpected ones. She did not answer him, as she was worried that he said that he had not planned any of this yet. Some time later, they arrived at a beautiful city. Elenik froze for a moment, as the beauty of the city impressed her. She knew that in her kingdom there was an atmosphere of the country, and in the empire, the city symbolized the sweet image of the country. At that very moment, she was taken aback as the emperor wrapped her up. The princess looked at the emperor in bewilderment, as she had not expected such a thing. He sighed heavily and said that everyone's attention could cause her inconvenience. She was a little puzzled, but when she looked closely into the distance, she saw a huge crowd. She felt awkward, even though she was wearing a cloak. After some time, they arrived at the palace. Having passed through the entire crowd, the young princess looked intently and with admiration at the emperor, as she saw that he was the ideal man. She understood that unfortunately, he could not be next to her, but she could still dream about it. At that very moment, the young princess was taken aback, as she saw a woman who rushed towards the emperor. The beautiful lady screamed at the emperor that he simply could not imagine how worried she was about him. At that very moment, the emperor froze for a moment when he saw his bride. Elenik was a little puzzled, as she did not expect to see something like this. Lady Hellas reached out to the emperor and said that she missed him very much. With tears in her eyes, she said that every day her pillow was wet with tears. She asked if he could imagine how she felt. The young princess was surprised, as she saw an incredibly beautiful girl in front of her. Elenik looked closely at the young lady, because she noticed that her voice was beautiful, and it seemed to her that she bewitched people with such a voice. She understood that if she were as beautiful as the lady, the emperor would definitely fall for her. But a moment later, she turned her gaze to the emperor in bewilderment, for he was angry. The emperor sighed heavily and said that he had been absent from the castle for several days. At that moment, the young lady covered her face and said that these days had been like years to her. He sighed heavily and said that he understood. Her Helenica was taken aback and looked at the emperor in surprise, as she did not understand what kind of expression he had on his face. Now she did not understand how he could look so calm and indifferent when a beautiful woman stood in front of him. She saw that the emperor was not only in love, he didn't even look interested. She was in shock. She didn't understand why he didn't console his bride. Elenik thought that she should most likely do something instead of the emperor, but at that very moment, she was taken aback and froze in place as she saw the menacing look of the young lady. And at the same moment, she felt very scared. A shudder ran through her body. At that very moment, the emperor said that this expedition did not present any danger. He asked the young lady if there was any need for her to come to the palace in person. She smiled tenderly and asked the emperor how he could be so heartless. She smiled and asked why she couldn't come to the palace where she would live in the future. Lady Hellas looked closely at the princess and said that the emperor had returned with a girl and that he was soon to become her husband. She asked who besides her should meet him. He sighed heavily and said that she was right. The princess in turn froze in place with her mouth open. She was shocked by what she heard. She looked closely at the young lady and wondered if she was the emperor's future wife. At that very moment, elements from the present plot flashed before her. She realized that this was the future empress and the mother of the young tyrant, and she was also a dark witch who revived corpses and summoned souls from hell. She looked closely at the young people as she realized that they were the dark magician's parents. At that very moment, the young princess was taken aback because she understood what the emperor meant when he said that he was not yet married. She clearly saw that he had a man whom he was going to marry. Elenik was shocked as she understood that her chances were reduced to zero because she could not compete with such a beautiful girl. The young lady, in turn, looked closely at the emperor and asked if he was wounded anywhere. Elenika immediately changed her plan because she understood that in such a situation it would be better for her to seduce the mother and not the villain's father, and then she would not teach him dark magic. She was in shock. She did not understand how a dark witch could be so beautiful. The emperor waved her off and casually told her to stop crying, as he did not have a handkerchief with him. The emperor sighed heavily, and looking at the young lady said that she had better return home. He reported that, to his regret, he could not simply hold his army. The emperor also said that he had an important guest now. The young lady nodded, agreeing with him. Elenik looked at the emperor with puzzlement. She knew he had a prickly side, but now she realized that his real defense was an impenetrable wall of indifference. She understood that although the young lady was his fiancée, but apparently his attitude towards the fiancée was not much different from the way he behaved towards her. Elenik sighed heavily, as everything had turned out just as she had expected. She understood that if such a beauty had failed to touch his heart, then she certainly would not have the opportunity to seduce him. A moment later, the princess was taken aback and shuddered as she felt something, and at the same moment, she felt the angry gaze of the young witch on herself. Elenik was puzzled because her head hurt very badly, and she felt dizzy. She involuntarily staggered as this pain felt different compared to previous times. She was confused as she was scared and at the same time heavy. She had a feeling as if she would soon fall and fall into the ground. She was very scared as she was being pulled deeper and deeper into the ground. But after a few seconds, she finally came to her senses and looked at the young lady with horror. At that very moment, she felt her evil gaze, which was filled with hatred with horror. Elenik was taken aback and wondered if the young, beautiful lady had just used her power on her. Lady Hellas approached the emperor and touched him tenderly, but at the same time, she asked him to set up the next meeting, as she missed him very much and could not wait for it. The emperor sighed heavily, and looking at the young lady, began to say something, but the young princess did not hear what they were saying, as everything was blurry for her, and she had the feeling as if all the blood was being taken from her body. She was taken aback as she was pulled deeper and deeper into the ground. At that very moment, she fell to the ground with a crash. The knights quickly ran up to her. She was in shock and burst into tears, but at the same time she was choking. She saw the emperor rushing towards her, but she could not even move. It seemed to her that she was dying. At that very moment, the emperor grabbed her by the shoulders and anxiously asked if everything was okay with her. She couldn't answer anything and only cried quietly, but now she realized that he had saved her again. Lady Hellas looked at the princess in surprise. The emperor, in turn, looked at her sideways. Lady Hellas sighed heavily and told the princess that, although she did not know her, it seemed to her that she was possessed. She looked at the emperor mockingly and asked why he had brought a woman into the palace who was connected with the dead. They froze for a moment and looked at her in surprise. The princess was furious, as she knew that the young lady was trying to kill her with her dark magic. The invisible hands of dying souls pull the living into the underworld. This is how the use of black magic was described. Elenik was shocked and did not understand what she had done. She understood that she did not deserve this at all. The emperor looked at his bride with anger and said that her words and actions were not acceptable towards the princess of another country. He looked at her angrily and said that she, as a subject of the empire, should not disgrace her ruler. She was taken aback, but a moment later said with a smile that she was just worried about him. Elenik looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Lady Hellas said with a smile that she now understood that before her was a member of the royal family, and at that very moment she asked the princess for forgiveness, and if she had convinced her of anything. Lady Hellas smiled and told the princess that she was not feeling well and that she was willing to take care of her as an apology. Elenik froze in shock, as the lady had just intentionally offended her and now was offering to take care of her. She glared at the young lady with anger, as she didn't want her to look at her with such an innocent expression, and after threatening to kill her, Elenik was furious, as she was not at all some naive girl. At that very moment, she fell to the ground again. She was breathing heavily and screaming that she was dying, but after a few seconds, she reached out to the emperor, and she was trembling with pain. The emperor sighed heavily, and looking at the young lady, said that one cannot relax with her for a minute. He reached out to her and used his power. At that very moment, he lifted her into his arms and hugged her like a little child. The young princess, in turn, was glad that everything was going according to her plan. She was aware of the fact that she was a very good actress, but at one time she was the queen of simulating illness. Eurydion looked closely at the knights and thanked them for their hard work, and he also said that they should go home and rest. The emperor turned around, looked at the young lady, and said that it would be better for her to leave today as well. She was shocked by the emperor's behavior, so she called him, but he ignored her. Elenik looked closely at the Dark Witch, as she knew that this was her failed assassination attempt. She knew that it was the young lady who was behind the murder of the emperor. Elenik looked at the witch with fury, as she did not want to allow such a good man to marry such a bad woman like her. She hoped that the emperor would choose anyone as his wife, except the evil witch. At that very moment, enjoying her victorious triumph, she made a face while looking at her rival. But at that very moment, the emperor looked at her in surprise, as he had not expected such a thing. He looked at her with a smirk and said that he didn't know what she was even planning, but her actions were too obvious. She looked at him in surprise and said that this simply couldn't be, but he smiled and said that it was. Elenik sighed heavily, as she realized that she was the type of person who showed everything secret on her face. She remembered how often she was scolded for the way her face looked. She sighed heavily and felt a little ashamed, because in the world of the book, she was listening to the same words as at work in reality. She smiled and said that for the first time, everything seemed real. But he said with a smile that the second time, it was obvious that she was pretending the princess was shocked, since he managed to see through her. He looked at him in surprise and asked why she did such a thing. The princess sighed heavily and said that she was afraid of the young lady. She sighed heavily because he realized that she was pretending, but still did not let her go. She felt a little awkward about Togo being so close to each other, but she didn't want to say it out loud. Eurydion sighed heavily and said that the young lady was the second mage of the tower, and she should still be afraid of her. Elenik looked at him in surprise and asked if he really knew that she was a mage. He looked at her in bewilderment and said that it would be strange if he did not know about it, since the magic tower was under the authority of the emperor. The princess was taken aback and thought for a moment, as she assumed that the girl was a black magician, and at the same time she hid her abilities. She knew very well that black magic was dark magic that was strictly prohibited on the continent. Dark magic steals the souls of the dead, who were supposed to return to God, and turns the bodies of the dead into puppets. Of course, if someone is caught using black magic, the punishment will be death. It was for this reason that black magic was studied secretly, and the knowledge was passed from teacher to student and from student to student. The princess was shocked, because despite all this, the young lady was a very powerful mage of the magic tower. She was puzzled and wondered if she had really crossed the path of such a terrible and powerful person. She sighed heavily and told the emperor that the young lady seemed to be very strong, but for some reason she felt very strange in her presence. She assumed that the emperor did not know the whole truth, and that was why he intended to marry her. The emperor looked closely at the princess and said that next time he would warn the young lady not to use magic in her presence. The princess, in turn, told the emperor to listen to her carefully as invisible hands reached out to her. She was cold and wet. The emperor sighed heavily and told his companion that he wanted her to meet with the young lady as little as possible, as she was used to using magic often. He knew that the girl had made a huge contribution to the improvement of the tower, and her magic was so strong that, thanks to her great success, had been achieved in the defense of the tower. The young princess froze in shock for a moment as she realized that she was doomed to eternal torment. She knew that she could not rely on luck, and she saw that he trusted the young girl and her abilities. Elenik wanted to tell him that he trusted the woman who was a dark witch, and she would not stop even in the face of death. She wanted to shout that she had read everything in the book, and it was the pure truth. But after a few seconds, Elenik was taken aback because she realized that she could not say such a thing to his face, because he would think she was crazy. Besides, she understood that if she did not keep her mouth shut, the young lady would be very angry with her. The emperor sighed heavily, and looking at his companion, said that the girl would no longer appear in the palace without an invitation. The princess, in turn, looked at the emperor with admiration and embarrassment as she realized that he was cool, but she also froze from his wonderful beauty. She looked away from the emperor, captivated by his beauty. But at that very moment, she froze as they slowly approached some beautiful building. She was a little surprised as she saw the bow-shaped roof, large windows, and also the ivory curtains. She was a little puzzled as this castle reminded her of the Kingdom Castle. She was taken aback and wondered if she would really live in such a place. At that very moment, she shouted to the emperor to let her go immediately. But on the spot, she remembered the lines from the plot itself, since this work of art reminded her of her native country. She remembered how her sister, looking at the beautiful masterpiece of architecture, cried, remembering her homeland. Elenik froze for a moment, as everything was just as it was described in the book, and at that very moment the maids greeted her. But the young lady was so captivated by the sight that she responded to them. But passing by the maid, she suddenly stopped and froze. Eleneka remembered that, according to the story, a maid with light brown hair and brown eyes asked the young princess how she was feeling while she was carefully tying the curtains. But the young princess looked at her with her empty eyes and said that she was fine. The southerner in the palace cared about the princess more than anyone else. Elenik looked intently at the maid and called her by name. Marianne was taken aback, as she did not expect to hear her name from the princess. But at that very moment, she greeted the princess with a smile. Elenik knew that, according to the plot, the maid was the closest person to her sister and niece. She was a little wary, as it was her first time meeting her, but she felt that the maid was very familiar. She was a little puzzled, as she did not understand why she felt strange. Elenik slowly climbed the stairs, as she knew that she would immediately come across a beautiful room. She knew that behind the door was the room where her sister lived. At that very moment, she entered the room and froze for a moment, as it was very bright. She knew that this was the room where the main character's life began. Elenik sighed heavily and slowly walked around the room. She knew that at sunset the room was flooded with sunlight, as it was written in the story. The young lady was a little puzzled, as she could not imagine that the world which had previously been only words to her was now coming alive before her. She had long since come to terms with what was in the novella, but for some reason, she now felt very strange. She wondered if it was all because of the one who would go to sister, who had suffered in a similar place for many years. The princess sighed heavily, as she now realized that she had tried very hard and averted her sister's similar review because she had prevented the kidnapping of her pregnant sister. She sighed heavily as she was tired after everything that had happened. She understood that no matter how close she was to the emperor, her condition was still very deplorable. A few seconds later, she threw all her thoughts away as she heard a knock on the door. She shuddered as she heard the voice of the emperor, who asked with a smile if she liked the palace. She smiled and said that she liked everything, and the emperor in turn was glad to hear this. She looked at him closely and wondered if he had deliberately chosen this palace because it was similar in style to the one in her kingdom. She knew that it was he who had organized all of this. At that very moment, the emperor sighed heavily and told the princess that he was interested in something. He looked at her with bewilderment, asking why she constantly addressed him as father. The young lady in turn was agitated and did not know how to answer such a question. A moment later, she looked away from him and said timidly that he reminded her of her father. She was lying to him, of course, but she couldn't tell the truth. He sighed heavily and said that she was not good at making excuses either, but the young lady insisted that it was the truth. But in turn, the emperor noticed that you were stubborn and had no equal. She looked sharply at him and asked what he was talking about. The emperor sighed heavily and said that he was not yet married and had no children. He asked the princess if she was exaggerating in her approach to him. Elenik sighed heavily and was puzzled, but looked at the emperor as she saw that he was simply sparkling with anger. She was surprised as she saw that he was simply incredibly beautiful. She sighed heavily and asked if he was really saying that she couldn't call him father. After a moment, she sighed heavily and said that she agreed and would not call him that. And she also asked for forgiveness. He looked at her with a laugh and said that the journey had been very difficult for her, so now she should have a good rest. Eurydion looked closely at the princess and said that he wished she would stop treating him so strangely. But he also said that if she had any problems, she should immediately call the maid. The young princess agreed. Eurydion, looking at the princess, said that although their beginning was not the best, but since she agreed to cooperate, one salvation will be to her as an honored guest. He also said that while she is in his country, she can feel free to ask for whatever she wants. The princess looked intently at the emperor, and since she saw that he was simply a wonderful person, his casual care and attention could not help but stir her heart. He was very caring, and so she thought that he was kind to everyone. But after this situation, and after how coldly he left the beautiful young lady, she was not sure about it. She wondered if he treated everyone who crossed the line this way, but she also wondered how far the line went. At that very moment, he announced that he was already leaving. The young princess was taken aback, as she had to ask him something, but she was deeply immersed in thought and forgot about it. Elenik quickly grabbed the emperor and asked him to stop. He looked at her in bewilderment. The emperor was a little puzzled and surprised by her behavior, but still looked at her with a smile. Elenik asked the emperor with lightning speed whether he intended to marry the young lady. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really talking about Lady Hellas now. The princess hastily said that she was. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed to be so, because she was ideally suited for the role of Empress. Young Fedya forgot how shocked she was by his answer. She was puzzled because she knew that the young lady was a dark witch who used forbidden magic, and yet she was also trying to kill her. Elenik knew perfectly well that the most important thing now was that the young lady would prepare the emperor's son so that he would kill him with his own hands. But now she understood that she could not give him a single reason why the young lady was not suitable for the role of empress, because she was just a captive, and his bride was a magician who made a huge contribution to the development of the empire. Elenik was puzzled and worried, because she understood that even if she said that the young lady was a dark witch, he still would not believe her. She did not know how she could achieve that he believed her more than the lady. At that moment, the emperor saw that she was deep in thought. He touched her hand tenderly, and she was taken aback as her fatigue suddenly disappeared. He looked at her intently and called out, but after a few seconds, he said that she was too careless. He looked at the young princess with a tender smile. She in turn anxiously asked what he was talking about. At that very moment, he carefully pulled her hand away and said that she should never let anyone into his personal space, especially in the bedroom. She was taken aback and shouted that he himself had entered the room, while she was very alarmed and offended at the emperor. At that moment, the emperor looked at her tenderly and slowly touched her face, and he also said that if anyone entered her bedroom without permission, she should immediately throw him out. He also asked her with a gentle smile not to hold the man any longer while he was leaving. The young princess was taken aback, as she did not expect to hear such a thing from him. But at that very moment, she plucked up her courage and asked the emperor if she had feelings. The emperor was taken aback by such a question and froze in place. Elenik looked closely at the emperor, as she realized that this was her chance to find out where the man drew his line. She wanted to know how far she could go and how much she could provoke the man who stood right in front of her in order to win against her rival. She knew very well that she didn't have many advantages that she could use for the good of the empire. But there was something she could offer him, and that was her beauty. She smiled and asked What if she said that she had feelings for the emperor? She was well aware of the fact that her appearance was not the same as her rivals, but she was still quite beautiful. She looked at the emperor with shining eyes and realized that she had missed the mark, as she should have said that she liked him in a sweeter and more shy voice. The emperor in turn sighed heavily and wondered what he should do with the girl. At that very moment, he said that she should never say such words to anyone under such circumstances. The young princess was taken aback and shuddered, as she did not expect anything like that. He sighed heavily and said that she shouldn't try to deceive him. With a playful smile, he said that he was quite an insightful person. She sighed heavily and looked away from him, because she understood that he was not at all a perceptive person, because he did not even know how evil a woman he trusted. She sighed heavily and asked if he really did not see the woman in front of him at all. He smiled and said that he could see that she was a woman, but still this fact in no way justified her careless actions. She looked at him angrily, but did not answer. Eurydion, looking at the princess, said that she never knew how things could turn out. As he was leaving, he said that it was time for him to go, so she should rest. The young princess was burning with anger and fury, looking after him. She now raised that he firmly said that her seductive techniques would never work on him. Eleanor stared after him, knowing she wouldn't stop there. She was burning with rage, for she was now determined to take his seduction seriously. She had already come up with a plan in her head and wanted to quickly put it into practice. The emperor, in turn, was puzzled. He did not understand what she was going to do, as he had such a feeling that the back of his head was burning from just her gloomy gaze. He turned around and looked at the princess with a smile, as he noticed that she was a very amazing woman. He knew that she looked cute, and although at first glance there seemed to be nothing special about her, she had an incredibly strong presence. He never intended to harm the princess they were supposed to take hostage. He hadn't originally organized the attack on the kingdom with any intention of committing a bloody massacre. It was merely a warning for the king's insolent behavior and their attempts to profit excessively from the stone smuggling. As emperor, he was obliged to make such bold statements. He deliberately selected his best soldiers and divided them into small groups, instructing them to make every effort to avoid death. Given this warning, it was now only a matter of time before the king would open the way. He understood that this was enough, but now he had the feeling that he had chosen someone very problematically captive. But the truth was that he couldn't help but think that they had taken hostage an innocent princess who had led a carefree life and knew no grief. Entering the office, he looked at his subordinate and asked if he had carried out his instructions. The young man sighed heavily and said that he had done everything, and also said that they had collected all the items that contained magic within a radius of 200 meters from the palace. The emperor thought for a moment and wondered if this distance would be enough. A few minutes later, the emperor told his subordinate to increase the radius. The young man was taken aback and said that if they increased the radius, then the main palace would also be included in the circle. Eurydion sighed heavily and said that he knew about this and asked the young man to carry out his order. He understood that it would take a month or more before the kingdom would open the road, and he had promised the princess safety, so he must show all sincerity in this matter. He understood that this would be better than accidentally finding her corpse when he was walking around the palace. At that very moment, the young man bowed and told the emperor that he would do everything as he ordered. He looked closely at his master, for he knew that in his normal state the emperor would not have gone to such lengths. He wondered if it was because the captive was a person of high birth. The emperor wondered if he was acting like this because she seemed very nice to him, but he didn't think she was pretending in front of Lady Hellas. But whatever the case, he was sure that that cunning woman was already burning with anger. He sighed heavily and looked into the distance with a smile, because he understood that the princess behaved this way without knowing anything, which is why she was so interesting to him. It seemed to him that she was like a little kitten who knew absolutely nothing about the world. The emperor looked at his subordinate and said that from now on, Lady Hellas could not appear in the palace, and he must inform her about this. The young man was amazed by what he heard. The emperor sighed heavily and said that he felt he had been too lenient towards her, and now she appeared in his imperial palace whenever she wanted, without even asking his permission. Felix looked at the emperor with a puzzled expression and said that he did not think the young lady would take the news well. He had never interfered with the young lady before, so she drove away the aristocrats who interfered with him. But now that he had a person to protect, he couldn't let her go and come whenever she wanted. The emperor understood perfectly well that this was the right decision, given the fact that she was a witch. No matter what the princess thought, all her thoughts and emotions were reflected on her face. He sighed heavily and told the young man that he entrusted this matter to him. Felix sighed heavily and told the emperor that he would do everything. Sometime later, the young princess sat quietly in her room. The maid had previously told the princess that since she was very tired after a long journey, she had slept for almost the entire day. Helenika understood perfectly well that if she slept for almost the entire day, then her body should feel lighter, but she did not feel rested. She understood perfectly well that it was very strange that she had slept the whole day and never woken up. She was sure that when she was near the emperor, her condition returned to normal. Elenik took a deep breath as she assumed she was very tired, and all because of this. After all, she had been riding a horse for several days. The maid looked closely at the young princess and said that she had been informed earlier that she needed special care due to her sensitivity to magic. The princess was surprised, looked at her and said that it was so, but she still assured the maid that everything was fine with her and she didn't have to worry. She understood that everything was fine because the only person who could treat her for mana intolerance was the ruler of this country. Elenik looked closely at the maid because she looked at her as if she were a princess who only had a short time to live, so she tried to maintain a smile in the last few days. Elenika, looking at the maid, said that she really didn't need to worry. But at that very moment, Marianne shouted that they had gotten rid of all the magical objects in the palace. She also informed the princess that they had removed all magical items, not only from the palace, but also within a radius of 500 meters. The princess was momentarily taken aback, as she was completely unfamiliar with the geography of the imperial palace. Mariana looked at the princess with a tender smile, as all the emotions were on her face. Marianne asked the princess if she wanted to go outside for a bit and look around. She also told the princess that they had marked out the area where the 500 meters ended, and it would not be difficult for her to notice the borders. The princess thought for a moment, as she did not understand how they did it. She understood perfectly well that she had to stay in the palace until the conflict between the countries was resolved, so she decided to get acquainted with the palace anyway. A moment later, she told the maid with a joyful smile that she would be happy to go and see everything. Sometime later, the princess went outside and noticed that the borders were hard to miss. She looked into the distance as she noticed a beautiful garden and wondered who it belonged to. At that very moment, the maid smiled and said that the main imperial garden was right in front of her. The maid said that the eastern border runs along the central imperial garden, and the western border runs along the end of the path near the Chirta Palace. The southern border ends at the training hall, and the northern border ends at the northern gate of the imperial palace. She said that these places are within the radius of the princess's palace. She smiled and told the princess that within this territory she could walk safely, but if she crossed the border, things would be bad for her. Elenik sighed heavily as she saw that the servant was telling her to be careful, because she did not know where and when the mana stones would be used. She sighed heavily, and since she knew that she was being treated much better than ordinary prisoners, she was still limited in her actions. But unfortunately, she could not complain because it was all her body's fault. She understood perfectly well that the empire was a very powerful country that relied on magic, so every year they transported a huge amount of mana stones, and it was only for her sake that her father got rid of all the stones. She was shocked because such care was not even mentioned in the plot. Elenik sighed heavily as she knew she had nowhere to go, and was in no position to complain. The maid looked closely at the princess and said that the emperor had ordered her to inform him when she wanted to go outside the palace. The young princess looked at the maid in surprise, as she did not expect anything like this, but this information was tempting to her. She wondered if this meant that they would meet in person. Elenik asked herself with a joyful smile whether it was possible that the impregnable wall around him yesterday was only in her imagination. She was glad since she did not expect anything else from their kind and caring emperor. At that very moment, she approached the maid and happily indicated where she wanted to go. But after a few seconds, she froze in place. The young man looked intently at the princess, and asked with a smile where he should accompany her. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not know who he was. He smiled and said that the emperor had ordered him to follow her wherever she went. He said with a smile that his name was Dierigo Schumart, and he is the priest of the Tower of Raulis. Elenik was very angry with the emperor, because she could not even believe that he had placed the priest of the tower near her. She wondered if this was not a silent sign on his part that he would no longer see her in person. Dierigo looked at the young lady closely and said with a smile that he was not as strong as the emperor, so it would take some time for him to be able to summon the divine spirit. But if she felt the slightest sign of weakness, she should immediately inform him of it. She sighed heavily as she realized that the emperor was a difficult person and had very little time because he was always busy, so he could not go with her everywhere. But still, the young princess was puzzled. She did not know how to seduce him if they did not even see each other. In fact, she had no intention of leaving the territory they had cleared for her, so she thought that the emperor would come to her. Helenika, in turn, did not want to bother the priest, but she knew that she had to study the imperial palace. At that very moment, she slowly walked outside the palace and wondered if everything would be all right with her. But now she realized that her decision was not useless, since the priest turned out to be a very good storyteller. For some time they walked around different places, and the priest told her everything clearly. Elenik was a little surprised, and at the same time happy as he provided her with a lot of useful information. At that very moment, she looked at the priest and timidly asked about Lady Helid. Elenik asked if the young lady was the emperor's fiancée. The priest sighed heavily, and looking away from the young princess said that they were not officially engaged, but the emperor had tentatively decided to consider her the future empress. Elenik was surprised by this. The priest said that this fact had been discussed many years ago, because by nature the young lady was a very active woman. He said that the emperor would not refuse the engagement in this situation, and that they would most likely be engaged by the end of the year. Helenika was puzzled by what she heard. She wondered what the situation was that was so ambiguous. She did not understand what the emperor wanted. She sighed heavily and said that she understood everything, and that perhaps the emperor had feelings for the young lady. The priest thought for a moment about what she said. At that very moment, he looked away from her and said that most likely this was not so. He told the princess that he did not know at all whether she noticed it or not. But no matter how kind and generous the emperor was, he had built a high wall around himself. Smiling, he said that the emperor was very magnanimous and indulgent. But if someone were to overstep that line, she looked at him in surprise and asked what would happen. The young man was taken aback and said that everything would be more or less normal, but he said that it wasn't a matter of him having feelings, but that he wasn't against marrying her. The priest stated that the young lady was an excellent strategic partner. Elenik understood perfectly well what he was talking about, as she had heard that the young lady would soon be the next chief mage of the tower. She understood that given her strength and influence, it was no wonder that the emperor considered her a suitable candidate. She sighed heavily as she realized that they were not yet officially engaged, which meant that his heart was still free. The priest looked closely at the princess and said that she must be especially careful in the palace. He said that the emperor lived in this place, and the future empress would also live there, so the palace was several times more reliable than other palaces, and since it was protected by magic, it could be said without exaggeration that it was strewn with mana stones. He looked at the princess intently and said that for this reason, she should make every effort to stay as far away from the main palace as possible, and she should not leave the garden area even if he was with her, because it was dangerous for her. Elenik understood perfectly well that for a weak person like her, this would be like a path to the deadly dungeon. But the problem was that there lived a beautiful emperor there, whom she had to protect and save from a terrible fate. She understood that if she wanted to save him, she had to see him, but unfortunately, she could not go there. Elenik had no intention of giving up, because she wanted to wait for the moment when he himself would come out to her. She understood that perhaps this was not a very effective method, but she had time for it. Unfortunately, she couldn't enter the training hall, so she intended to wait for him in the garden. From that day on, she wanted to create her nest in the main imperial garden, right in front of the imperial palace. From the priest, the young princess learned when the emperor took a break She prepared a book to kill time, while she waited for him, knowing that she must strike while the iron was hot. For several days, she wandered around the garden, hoping to meet the emperor. But all was in vain. She was very offended by the emperor, since they had not met for a week, and he had not even shown himself in public. Elenik sighed heavily, and looking at the priest said that he had lied to her. He was taken aback and looked at her in surprise, not expecting to hear anything like that. But at that very moment, he said that he is a man who serves God and cannot lie. Elenik sighed heavily, as she did not understand why she could not see the emperor. She was puzzled because she was already very tired, because she simply did nothing and waited for him. But this seemed to her a very difficult and painful task. Initially, the young lady thought that her main problem was mana intolerance. But this was not so, because even being on the emperor's land was incredibly difficult for her. She understood that if she could hold the emperor's hand at least once, all this would quickly end. She felt that when she simply sat doing nothing, energy was leaving her. At the same time, the priest was always on the alert since he had to use his divine power at any moment. Elenik was very puzzled, because she knew that she could not use his powers, even if she was very tired. The servant smiled and told the princess that the emperor must be very busy because he usually goes for a walk at least once a day. She smiled and told the princess that because of the trip to the kingdom, he had put off a lot of things, so now he was busy with them. She asked the princess not to worry too much. Elenik sighed heavily, knowing that it was not much of a consolation. She knew that the emperor simply did not want to see her. But at the same time, she wondered if she had been too persistent, or if he had gotten tired of her clinging to him when she was feeling bad. Elenik sighed, as she was sure that because of the fact that you had put her in all sorts of ugly situations before him in the past, her reputation was ruined. But at that very moment, she was taken aback and wondered if she was simply not his type. Now she assumed that he liked sexy and seductive women. She remembered the young and beautiful lady as her gaze was languid, and her red lips were very sexy. The princess knew that this was why he married her, despite the fact that he was well aware of her cruel nature. She understood perfectly well that they would still look beautiful together. Now she imagined herself with the emperor. But at that very moment, she was taken aback, as she realized that this was a sharp change in genre, since one mark was for adults, and the second for all ages. She sighed heavily as she realized that, after all, any person's taste can change as many times as they want. She was sure that she could also move into the adult category. She wanted to burst into the emperor's hall and shout that from now on, she was his ideal type. This is exactly what she wanted to tell him, but unfortunately, she couldn't even enter the palace, so she knew that nothing like that would come of it. Elenik sighed heavily and decided to throw all thoughts away. She knew that a strategic retreat was not what she needed. She understood that if he didn't want to see her, then she would make it so that he would have no choice but to see her. The next day, Anna at the same time confidently walked into the imperial garden. She had the impression that he did not go out into the garden on purpose, because he knew that she was waiting for him. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise, as she was shocked by her behavior. She was taken aback and asked in surprise what the young princess was doing on earth. Helenika did not pay any attention to the servant, since she knew that she had to wait for him quietly in the garden, but so that he would not see her. She turned around and, looking at the maid, asked her to be quieter. Helenika understood perfectly well that if he did not come out now, she would be convinced that he was busy. She wanted to see which of them would win, since he was an impregnable wall, and she was persistent. The emperor sighed heavily and glanced out the window. He knew that the time had already struck for his walk. But he also knew that many days had already passed, and the young princess was again waiting for him in the garden. He sighed heavily, because he understood that if he had been on the first floor, he would not have noticed her, and he also assumed that she had not thought at all that he could see her sitting on the second floor. No matter how much he thought about it, he was sure that she was waiting for someone. Based on his inferences, he realized that she was waiting for him. The emperor knew he hadn't seen her for several days, and he knew that if he let this situation slide, she wouldn't stop there. He sighed heavily, because he had assumed that she would sit in the garden until lunchtime. At the same time, he was a little worried that she was hiding where he could clearly see her. Eurydion sighed heavily and thought that he still shouldn't have allowed her to enter the imperial garden. He liked the peace and quiet, but he thought it wouldn't hurt to liven things up once in a while. so he decided to allow the youngest princess to move around the palace freely. But the problem was that she continued to persistently pursue him for several days, and at the same time, she distracted him from work. Eurydion sighed heavily and looked closely at the princess because he knew that it was not at all like her to be so sluggish. But at the same time, he didn't think that she would constantly catch his eye. He knew that she had been moving freely around the palace all week, so she had no reason to be so depressed. Eurydion knew perfectly well that it would be strange if he didn't worry about her, considering that she looked like a small lost kitten. At that very moment, he would wonder if he should play with her once he sighed heavily, because he realized that he had already lost. The emperor was a little puzzled, and at the same time surprised, as it seemed to him that he was interested in the young princess. Eurydion was the only child in the family. His few cousins received titles and left the palace long ago. After the death of the emperor's father, he became the only member of the imperial family. As a result, from childhood, he became accustomed to a quiet and calm life and adhered to a strict routine. Not many things could upset a man like the emperor. Lately, for example, the king's arrogant behavior had been getting on his nerves. But even more than the incident with the king, he was exhausted by one person, namely a woman of high rank, who was putting the magic tower into operation, and who had arbitrarily declared herself his bride. This woman was extremely ignorant in matters concerning human feelings. She acted as if she loved him more than anyone in the world and flirted with him, but he looked at her face, and all she could think about was how to stab him in the back. He understood perfectly well that it would be a good idea to distance himself from her. The emperor knew that they would not have been in such a close relationship if it were not for the necessity of subordinating the magic tower to the imperial family. He was well aware that it was obvious that the lady knew what he was thinking, because every time she poured him tea, she tried to look into his face. But when he saw the seductive face with which she tried to charm people, he wondered what she really wanted, a woman who was ready to attack, and forced him not to let down his guard for a single minute. He knew that she was one of the main obstacles that was preventing his dreams of relaxation from coming true. He understood that, compared to the snake, the younger princess was like an open book. He understood that the young ladies interfered with his daily routine, but they evoked completely different feelings in him. Unlike the actions of the young lady, the actions of the princess did not cause him irritation or hostility. Eurydion understood perfectly well that if we talk about their attempts to knock him out and look for her, then the princess dealt with this in just a week, while the young lady who proclaimed herself his bride had been experiencing failures for many years since the day they met. At the same time, he understood that the princess herself had no idea how she had managed to achieve such enormous success. Elenik sighed heavily because she felt very brave when she came to the emperor, but now she felt that she would soon leave this world. Now she ate well and slept a lot, but she still felt very weak and depressed. She knew that in the first days she did not have even minor symptoms of magic rejection, but after only a few days of observing, she could confidently say that the empire was not at all suitable for her to live in. She knew that the empire was holy, but it didn't even have its own mana stones. The princess assumed that she was feeling unwell because of the huge amount of mana stones that were brought from the Western Kingdom, but she also assumed that it was because of the large number of magicians. Elenik knew that if none of this explained her condition, then most likely her condition was influenced by the dark magic that the young lady had previously used on her. Elenik couldn't resist and laughed hysterically because she understood that in such a situation, and even if she ever decided to run away to the kingdom, it would be the day of her death. But she also understood that a long stay in the empire would be dangerous for her. She was taken aback and wondered what she would do if she woke up one day and couldn't open her eyes. The princess knew that she couldn't just let an ordinary maid down and ask her to call the emperor, but she also knew that she couldn't just barge into the emperor's palace without permission. Elenik was shocked because she had a feeling that she was going to die soon. She was furious because she knew things weren't that bad now, but she didn't know what she would do tomorrow if she suddenly couldn't get out of bed. She knew what she had to do to avoid death, but she couldn't put that action into practice. Elenik sighed heavily and became sad, as she understood that now was not the best time for the emperor to avoid her. She was furious because he decided to separate from her, so she mentally screamed that he was just a heartless person. She sighed heavily as she realized that she didn't need anything from him at all. but still she would be glad if he just came to her. Elenik was hoping for a hug or intertwining of fingers. The princess just wanted to see his beautiful face. Elenik wanted to be near him, because she was sure that then she would feel better. At that very moment, she cast aside all her thoughts and became more relaxed as she heard the emperor's voice and turned around in a hurry. She froze for a moment as she smelled the pleasant aroma and felt as if it immediately cleansed her body. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was doing here. But at that very moment, she rushed towards him. The princess knew that on this earth, her body was being destroyed, and he was her only salvation. A few seconds later, she grabbed the emperor's hand and felt herself begin to be cleansed by his energy. Elenik breathed a sigh of relief as she felt a sudden lightness in her body. At that very moment, she looked at the emperor in surprise as he carefully picked her up in his arms. She froze and stared at him. But a moment later, the young princess reached closer to him and wrapped her sweet little arms around him. At that very moment, she hugged him tightly and burst into tears. The emperor glanced sideways at the young princess and began to say something about her condition, but she did not listen to him at all. She felt how her weakened body was filled with living energy. He sighed heavily and hugged her tenderly, but at the same time, he lightly and quietly patted her on the back, thus calming her down. A moment later, he slowly carried her to the small gazebo. A moment later, he gently sat her down on the table and called her. The princess in turn did not want to let him go. She knew that if she fell, the earth would swallow her up again. She wanted to be with him longer because she didn't know when he would be able to return to her again. He sighed heavily and said that he left her because he thought she was feeling better. She was flushed with rage and anger and wondered if he thought she looked good now. In turn, she wanted to absorb his scent. Elenik wanted to feel free and not feel pain. She didn't want to be tired and depressed anymore. Now she felt how he had been tenderly stroking her back all this time. At that very moment, a wave of melancholy washed over her. She was furious because she didn't understand why he was putting up an iron wall around himself if he was ultimately kind to her again. She was furious because she knew he shouldn't have ignored her if he was going to act like that. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed she had already calmed down a little. He slowly pulled her away from him, but the princess was not going to give in because she did not want him to see her tear-stained face again, so she hugged him even tighter. She understood that she should no longer allow herself to cry in front of the emperor like a child. Eurydion sighed heavily and said that he had to look at her face to understand what state she was in now. Eurydion said tenderly that it would only be for a few seconds, and she should raise her head. The princess finally gave in and did as he asked. She sighed heavily because the maid had done her hair today, and she had tried very hard, but now she had ruined everything. At that very moment, the emperor looked at her tenderly and asked her to raise her head. Elenik froze and looked intently into the emperor's eyes. Elenik sat quietly in place as the emperor looked her over. She knew that she looked better today than last time, and now she realized that she had avoided a repeat of the terrible situation. He stared at her for a moment, taking in every inch of her body. She sighed heavily and said that she was feeling better, but she did not raise her eyes to him. Elenik felt the terrible feeling that had been pressing on her just a moment ago, but now she felt that it had completely disappeared. A moment later, her expression changed, and puffing out her beautiful cheeks, she nervously told the emperor that he was very busy. He looked at her in surprise and said that he was still a little busy. She was furious and angry. She could not stand it and shouted that if he had been a little busier, she would have already. But at that very moment, she stopped and did not finish. He looked at her intently and asked what would have happened. She looked at him angrily as she wanted to scream that she would have died from the loss of energy. Elenik sighed as she realized that she needed to calm down because she didn't want to be angry at him when she finally got to see him after a long time. She understood that it was not surprising that he had a lot of work because he was the emperor. She understood that he should not drop everything just to take care of her. Elenik sighed heavily and said that nothing would have happened. She realized that she had acted as if he should do it. At that very moment, the emperor came closer to her and asked if the priest was not enough for her. She sighed heavily and said that the priest was not the same person as the emperor, and she was not a leech at all and could not suck divine powers out of him like blood. Eurydion looked at her with a tender smile and asked what about him. At the same moment, she shouted to the emperor that he was different from the priest. She looked at him intently and said that all he needed to do was take her hand. Love between people arises as suddenly as the realization that their clothes were soaked in the rain. She knew that when he came to, he would already be her prisoner. The princess knew that if love at first sight didn't happen, then she had no other choice. Eurydion looked at the princess with a cold, intent gaze and said that when she needed help, she should immediately turn to a priest. He asked if the divine power was not to be used for healing. What was the purpose of using it at all? The princess looked at the emperor intently and said that if she went to the priest and received divine power from him, she would feel better, but it would be very exhausting for him. Eurydion sighed heavily and said that everything was correct. She said that when she was near him, she felt better just from his presence. It was good for both her and the emperor, because he was saving a man's life. She knew that the unfortunate secondary characters had to build a mutually beneficial relationship. Helenika, looking at the emperor, asked if he could meet with her at least once every few days. She shouted that she would not disturb him and would not take up much of his time. Elenik screamed with tears in her eyes that he had promised her safe passage, but if she died in the Empire, she would haunt him even when she became a ghost. She was furious because she knew that she had not come to the Empire just to die. The Emperor in turn thought about her words for a moment, but a moment later he said that he would be very busy for the next few days. She was shocked because she understood that if he again fenced himself off with an iron wall after everything she said, it would be much more difficult for her to get through to him. He sighed heavily and said that they could arrange a meeting in a few days at the same place and time. But this meeting would last no more than half an hour, because that was all he could promise her. The princess looked at him with joy, since she had achieved what she wanted. He looked at her closely and said that besides this, he would often appear in the garden, so she should not hide in strange places like today. She was taken aback and wondered if this meant that he did not find her by chance, but knew from the beginning that she was hiding. The emperor smiled and, looking at the princess, said that the windows of his office were quite large. She was taken aback and burst into anger, because now she realized that he had been deliberately avoiding her. She realized that he was not kind at all. Now she knew that he was as evil as his future son. The emperor sighed heavily, and looking at the young princess, said that he had already told her about this several times, because unlike ordinary priests, Dierigo, the high priest, is responsible for conducting the rituals. He told the princess that she should not feel guilty for receiving his divine power. The emperor told the princess that if she felt ill and he was not around, she should definitely contact the high priest. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand why he was saying such words, and it sounded like a quiet and sweet grumbling. She looked at him in bewilderment, because he mentioned the high priest. He asked in bewilderment if she had never heard of him, since even in her kingdom they knew about him. Elenik sighed heavily, as it was assumed that the former princess knew about this, but she also knew that in the kingdom, you would find it even more difficult to meet a priest than a magician. At that moment, she was taken aback and wondered if he was really famous. The emperor looked at her with a smile and said that he would be the next archbishop, as he himself was going to appoint him to this position, while he touched her face tenderly. Eurydion looked at her with a smile and said that besides himself, a direct descendant of the imperial family, there were only 5 people in the country who were endowed with divine powers. The princess was taken aback as she realized that Dirigo was the high priest and was also supposed to become the next archbishop. She was taken aback and froze in shock as she realized that she had been chatting and drinking tea with the busy man. Eurydion sighed heavily and told the princess that he had not lied to her when he promised to take care of her safety, but he also said that he had the impression that she did not believe him. Looking away from her, Eurydion said that she was right after all. The young princess's expression changed, and she thanked him with a smile, because she already thought that he would take his words back. She knew that their meeting was very short, but she was in no position to complain. He looked at her in surprise and said that she should not thank him. He was taken aback when he saw her radiant smile. Elenik was a little puzzled, because just a few minutes ago, she was exhausted, ready to burst into tears. But now she was sure that the emperor was ideal for restoring energy. The emperor, in turn, looked at the princess with a gentle smile, as he was glad that she was better. She was taken aback and froze in embarrassment because she saw that he was handsome. Helenika wanted to seduce the emperor, but his handsome face constantly distracted her from her intended plan. She had tried to use her beauty against him, but now she realized that she had become a hostage to his beautiful face. Helenika was angry with herself because she understood that she simply could not be the first to fall in love with him. She knew that all the women in the world wanted to fall at his feet, so he built an impenetrable wall around himself. The emperor sighed heavily and asked the princess what was the matter and why she was looking at him so intently. She sighed heavily and at the same moment said that he was very handsome, but at the same time she again called him Mr. Father Eurydion, sighed heavily and said that she should watch how she addressed him. Elenik sighed heavily because she knew that he really didn't like it when she addressed him as father. Looking at the emperor, she realized that, until now, she did not know a lot about him, what he liked and what he did not like. She did not know where he drew the line that could not be crossed. She wondered at what point he would push her away. Elenik understood perfectly well that whatever the case, the iron wall she faced and the iron wall Lady Helid faced were not very different. She understood that they were not engaged, and she had a chance. Elenika knew that she had to act slowly and carefully, so she wanted to check everything and find the weak points. And then one by one, she wanted to attack persistently. Elenik looked at the emperor with a satisfied grin, because she knew that when he came to his senses, she would cover everything with herself and create a wall beyond which he would not be able to go, just as she could not enter the boundaries of the fence with white scarves. The emperor sighed heavily, and looking at the princess said that she now looked as if strange thoughts had visited her head again. She was taken aback as she realized that her face had betrayed her emotions, but at the same moment she said that nothing like that was going through her head. Eurydion sighed heavily and said that he didn't think he could afford to let his guard down around her. She was taken aback because she didn't want him to make things any more difficult for her. Elenik understood that she had only just begun to break down his wall, and he could not immediately rebuild it. She sighed heavily as she hoped that he would weaken his defenses. After their conversation, she went to the garden every 3 days. She happily met with the emperor, and after their meetings, her fatigue disappeared. Just his presence was enough for Togo to heal her. She was upset that they only met once every 3 days, which meant no more than twice a week. But unfortunately, the princess could not do anything about it. Elenik knew that although the emperor rarely spoke about himself, it seemed as if he worked without direction, without even stopping for sleep. Elenik looked closely at the emperor, as she realized that he was trying not to show it to her, but she saw that with each passing day, he looked worse. Elenik supposed that she saw the changes in him so clearly because she knew his usual expression, relaxed compared to the previous times. Helenika looked at the emperor with admiration, and she knew that he looked better with such an expression on his face than with an impenetrable look. She also knew that he was puzzled, but her face was also beautiful from any angle. He looked at her intently and asked what she would say. The young princess was taken aback, as she was lost in thought, and did not listen to him. The emperor sighed heavily, and a moment later asked if she would like to write a letter home. The princess froze in shock, as she had not expected anything like this. At that very moment, she jumped to her feet and asked the emperor if she could really write a letter to her family. He sighed heavily and said that under any other circumstances, he would not have even considered this option. But her father threatened to destroy the road if they did not send him a letter written in her handwriting. The young princess looked at the emperor in surprise, as she did not expect to hear anything like this. But a moment later, she was taken aback as it dawned on her what the emperor had said. She wondered if he had been spending all his time in the study and for her father. She knew that several weeks had passed since she had been kidnapped and brought to the empire. She was happy that she was safe, so to her shame, she forgot about everything else. She knew nothing at all about what it was like to have parents, because they had died when she was still a child, but she knew that she was now the youngest princess, and so she clearly imagined her family's reaction. The princess knew that the most important thing was to stay alive, but there were things that she could not and should not forget. But for some reason, she forgot about the important things, and now she felt a very strong burden of guilt because she forgot about her family. The emperor sighed heavily and told the princess that her family thought that he had locked her in a small room and was not taking care of her, and he did not like such unfair accusations at all. She sighed heavily, as they had prepared beautiful clothes for her. She had eaten very hearty and delicious food. They had built her a palace that reminded her of her home and had removed all the manna stones, and now she understood that the emperor was right, as there was no prisoner who would live in the same conditions as she did. The emperor looked closely at his captive and said that it would be preferable if they showed her to him with magic instead of a letter, but they had to take into account her condition. And besides, there was no magician in the kingdom that they could contact. The princess sighed heavily and said with a smile that her kingdom was practically a village. The emperor looked at her in bewilderment, as he did not understand what she was talking about. But at that very moment, she smiled and said that she would write the letter immediately. Elenik wrote happily to her family that she was doing well and that she had no difficulties in the empire, and she also said that everything was fine with her and that they should not worry too much. But still the young lady asked if everything was all right with her sister. After all, she was worried that her sister might be having a very hard time now, since there was very little time left before the birth. At that very moment, Eurydion, looking at the princess, said that she was free to write whatever she wanted, since he had no intention of checking the contents of the letter. She looked at him in surprise and happily asked if this was true. Elenik understood perfectly well that if this was the case, then she should take this opportunity to write to father that everything was fine with her and that he should wait a little with the decision about the road. She wanted him to give her at least a year of time. At that very moment, the emperor looked at her intently. A few seconds later, he said that he had changed his mind and that she should show him the letter as soon as she finished it, because her expression suddenly made him nervous. She was taken aback in a way she had not expected. Elenik sighed heavily and said that she had heard that the ruler of the empire always kept his word. She was puzzled, as she knew that the emperor was as elusive as a ghost. He sighed heavily and said angrily that when she spoke like that, he began to think that she was up to something. She shouted that, of course, this was not so, but in fact she knew that he was right. Elenik sighed heavily, as she had the feeling that the more she talked, the more she backed herself into a corner. A moment later, she gave him the letter and he handed it to the maid. Elenik was taken aback and froze for a moment in surprise, since he did not even open it. Helenika was very angry with the emperor because she realized that she had to write what she wanted. She looked at him with a smile, as he irritated her very much, and today more than usual. But unfortunately, she could not write anything about the negotiations because she was afraid that he would check the letter. Elenik sighed heavily and wondered what she would do if her father opened the way. She was sure that as soon as they came to an agreement, he would immediately send her back to the kingdom. The princess understood perfectly well that this could not be allowed, because if she returned to the kingdom now, she would die within a few years, and the emperor would marry a dark witch. She hoped to reach her father's heart from a distance, because she confirmed in the letter that she was fine, so he should hold out as long as possible. Elenik sighed heavily, not knowing what to do next. The emperor looked at her with a smile and said that he did not understand her at all, and he could not understand whether she wanted to return to the kingdom or not. Elenik sighed heavily and asked if she said she didn't want to go back, would he let her stay in the empire? He looked at her in bewilderment, as he did not know why she liked the empire more than the kingdom. But at the same moment, he said that there were priests in the kingdom too. Elenik looked at him in surprise, as this was big news for her. Elenik smiled and asked that if she said that there was a reason why she liked the empire more than the kingdom, she knew that he would not send her back, because she had a good reason. Eurydion sighed heavily, looking at the princess, and said that he really hoped that she was not planning anything strange. He did not understand why she should stay in a country in which her body suffered so much and where she had no loved ones. She sighed heavily and asked if he could give her a break sometimes. She didn't understand why he was such an unbearable person. Eurydion sighed heavily and asked her to stop. She completely agreed with him, as she wanted him to stop pretending to listen to her. The princess sighed heavily because she knew that she couldn't let him send her home just because she tried to break through his wall and crossed the line. She knew she still had time. At that very moment, the princess looked at the emperor with a joyful smile and asked if he was busy today. He sighed heavily and said that he had finished with all his urgent matters. She was surprised and immediately understood why his face was much happier than last time. She smiled and asked if this meant that he would stay with her a little longer today. He looked at her in surprise and asked if this was really what she wanted. At that very moment, Elenik with joy asked him to take her hands, and she also, with a joyful smile, asked him to hug her. She sighed heavily and looked closely at the emperor as she saw his usual reaction. But she hoped that if she said this at least 100 times, he would agree at least once, and now she spoke such words out of habit, not really hoping for anything. But now she looked at him in surprise, because she understood that something had changed today. She froze for a moment in surprise as she saw his gentle smile directed towards her. Elenik was embarrassed by such a sight. At that very moment, he touched her, and a stream of power came over her. The princess was taken aback as he sent her a stream of divine power just as a priest did. She was confused and shouted that this was a scam on his part. The emperor could transmit power with or without touching the priest, purposefully transmitted power without touching it. Eurydion looked at her with a smile and asked what she was talking about, since he was sure that this way the power was transmitted faster and there was no need to touch each other for a long time, and it seemed to him that this was a more effective way. Eurydion looked at her closely and said that he thought that she should not touch him anymore. She was taken aback in a way that she did not expect. Eurydion said with a smile that she was too careless. The princess was confused and did not understand what his words meant. She had no intention of letting him go so easily, and at that very moment, she stood up from her chair and hastily asked what his words meant. She looked at him intently, not only with sadness, but also with his facial expression, as she now realized that she had been mistaken in thinking that this was his usual facial expression. Eurydion looked intently at the princess and said that today she should no longer leave her castle. She was confused and did not understand what he was saying at all. He sighed heavily and said that there would be a guest in the palace today. A moment later, he announced that Saleh Elad would come to him at the palace. That same evening, the young lady was very nervous and kept thinking about the wicked witch, who was soon to meet with the emperor. At that very moment, the young maid saw that the princess was very nervous, so she tried to calm her down a little. Mariana looked at the princess with a tender smile and asked if something was bothering her. The princess in turn was taken aback. She could no longer contain her emotions. At that very moment, she threw herself into the arms of the maid because she did not know what to do next. She knew that soon a dark witch would come to the palace who was capable of "We live burying people in the ground." Marianne looked at the princess with bewilderment and a smile, as she did not understand why she was upset. Marianne smiled and told the princess that if she drank some warm milk, she would feel a little better. The princess sighed heavily, and she really did calm down after drinking the warm milk. But still, she was worried, because she did not know what the evil witch wanted. She wondered if she really loved the emperor. Elenik had heard before that the witch had been with the emperor for a long time, but she was still puzzled as she did not understand why the strong woman was afraid of her captive princess from a tiny country. Elenik was puzzled and did not understand why the young lady wanted to kill her at their first meeting. She wondered if it was all because of jealousy. Elenik was taken aback as the memories made her mood worse. She knew that it didn't matter whether the young lady loved the emperor or not. What was more important was what she planned to do with him. She knew that her young lady was targeting a man who was endowed with an energy that was opposite to hers. She remembered how the young lady, with a fierce grin, told her son that he was a raft of the most powerful divine energy and the darkest mana. She knew that he could have everything he wanted. Elenik knew perfectly well that the young lady could cross the boundary between heaven and earth to reach God, and if she wanted, she would use her son to do so. Elenik understood perfectly well that she had failed in the experiment because as soon as the boy learned dark magic, he lost his divine powers. But still, the princess was a little puzzled because she did not know why everything turned out this way. Elenik didn't understand why she used her own son to unite the two energies together. She didn't understand what the lady was trying to achieve in such a thing. Elenik sighed heavily as she knew there were many strange prices in the novel, but most of them did not include the young lady. She sighed heavily as she realized that she had to stay in the palace tomorrow for her own good, as the emperor had said. considering what the young lady had done on their first meeting. Elenik knew perfectly well that she could not avoid her, but her lady, every time she came to the palace, even if she was sent to the kingdom, she must prevent the marriage between the emperor and the dark witch. Elenik knew perfectly well that she could make at least a few attempts to interfere with them, so she wanted to interfere with them every time they met, as well as use the weaknesses of her body, and thus expose her as a dark witch. She understood that if she chose the first option, it would automatically lead her to the second option. Elenik was aware of the fact that if she interfered with them, she could die from black magic, and then her lady would be exposed as a dark witch. She understood that her death would allow the emperor to live a long and happy life. But still, she was puzzled, because she could not die at such a young age. She understood that this was bad and the end, because she had started all this in order to survive. The princess sighed heavily and looked intently into the distance, because she understood that she had to think everything through. She understood that she had to do everything as usual and think through all her steps carefully. Eurydion walked slowly to meet the young lady. He knew that 3 weeks had passed since their last meeting with Lady Hellas. He himself had already rescheduled their meetings several times, but now he understood that there was nowhere to put it off any longer. And in turn, he would have preferred that she simply write him a report, since she was responsible for the reports on the magic tower. He knew she probably couldn't be trusted, but she was a great mage, and she was also his connection to the tower. Eurydion didn't know for sure, but if nothing happened, she could become his companion for life. Sometimes he was even frightened by the thought that he would have to be on guard his whole life until the death of the Empress. Eurydion understood perfectly well that mistakes were unacceptable, and he needed to keep up appearances. Unfortunately, he felt cornered. He hadn't allowed her into the palace for weeks, so he couldn't even imagine how she would hang on to him. But a moment later, the emperor was taken aback and looked into the garden in bewilderment. He froze for a moment as his biggest problem was in front of him. The emperor was shocked as he saw in front of him a young princess who sparkled and struck him with her beauty. But a moment later, their eyes met. She looked at the emperor with a joyful smile, and at that very moment, the young princess ran to the emperor with lightning speed. She knocked on his window with a joyful smile. After a few seconds, she asked him to open the window. Elenik looked at the emperor with a joyful smile as he opened the window for her. The emperor sighed heavily, and looking at the princess, said that he had previously told her that she needed to sit quietly in the palace today. He was taken aback and wondered if he had forgotten to warn her, but after a few seconds, he was sure that he had warned her. But in turn, the young princess looked at him with an innocent smile. He sighed heavily as he realized that the princess was not the kind of person who listened to others. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she really had not listened to him. Elenik said with a smile that she is an unpredictable woman. He looked at her closely, as it seemed to him that she looked as if she could disappear at any moment, and he knew that he would not be able to find her later. But in turn, he wondered if it was all because of the white dress. It seemed to him that it would be better if she did not wear white clothes from that day on. The emperor looked closely at the young princess and carefully touched her. He was interested in everything connected with her, since he knew much less about her than about his future bride. But he saw that she was a very bright and lively girl, and looking at her, he could not help but feel happiness. He looked at her intently and asked why she came to him, even though she knew that it was very dangerous for her. Elenik looked at him in surprise, and at that very moment said that she had come only for one thing. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked why she had come. At that very moment, she took his hand with a joyful smile and shouted that she was going to kidnap him. The emperor immediately froze in place in surprise. Eurydion looked closely at his companion with a gentle smile. He was pleasantly surprised, as he did not expect such a thing. Eurydion looked at her with a tender smile and asked how she was going to do something like that. The princess smiled and said that she had very little experience in this, so Elenik was hoping for his help. She smiled and asked if he wanted her to kidnap him. He preferred that she pester him all day. The emperor sighed heavily since she left him with almost no choice. He looked at her with a smile and asked if the princess really didn't like something, since she had decided to take such a step. Elenik smiled and said that she didn't like his schedule today and she was going to disturb him. He looked at her closely as he saw that she was serious. The princess smiled and told the emperor that he was not engaged yet, so it did not matter whether he spent time with her or with Lady Helody. Elenik looked at the emperor with a smile and said that she would guarantee his safety, and he could be sure of that. Elenik looked at the emperor with a playful smile and asked if she could count on his assistance. She sighed heavily and said that it seemed impossible, considering that her words sounded like a threat. He looked at her in bewilderment, as he was a little surprised. He looked at her with a smile, since she addressed him with the same words as he had when he promised to take care of her. For this reason, he was surprised. The emperor knew that there was half an hour left before lunch with the sorceress. He knew perfectly well that she was aware of how meticulous he was about the schedule, so she would come on times. He froze for a moment, wondering what she had done before for Togo to keep other women away from him. At that time, he liked it this way because her behavior was to his advantage. He knew that she was involved in a lot of scandals. But looking at the princess, he was sure that she was not that kind of girl, and she was not at all capable of starting a scandal. But in turn, he understood that too friendly a relationship with a captive princess from another country would not be good for either of them. At that very moment, the young princess asked the emperor with a smile if he was going with her. He sighed heavily and said that if he were him, he could resist her. He sighed heavily, looking at the princess, as it seemed to him that she had come to him conditionally, knowing how he did not want to follow today's schedule. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he intended to do. But after a few seconds, the emperor with grace and lightness jumped out of the window. Eurydion looked at her with a smile and said that he was listening to her. Eurydion smiled and asked what she was going to do after she kidnapped him. The princess froze in place in shock, as she could not believe that she had succeeded. He looked at her in surprise as she did not answer the question. The princess was taken aback and wondered if she had really managed to lure the man. She was happy in her soul as she realized that choosing the reverse technique was the right decision to lure him out. At that very moment, she looked away from him and smiled. A few seconds later, she extended her hand to him and asked why they didn't run away. The emperor smiled and at that very moment took her hand. Some time later, they slowly arrived somewhere. The young princess was surprised and at the same time puzzled as she saw that the emperor was surprisingly gentle with her at the moment. She wondered if he was trying to be generous this time, although she was grateful to him for it. Elenik thought for a moment, wondering what the great and dark witch would do to her if she inadvertently became a witness to the abduction of the emperor. Elenik suggested that the sorceress would kill her secret so that no one would know. Elenik was a little puzzled and understood that today she would have to spend the whole day with the emperor. After some time, the young lady stopped in place and looked intently at the emperor because she had the feeling that she had been played again. She did not understand why this was all happening to her, because she did it for them. Helenika looked intently at the emperor, while Anna slightly puffed out her beautiful cheeks and told the emperor that one day he would thank her for this. He looked at her in bewilderment, as he did not understand what she was talking about. But after a moment, he smiled and said that maybe it would happen someday. At that very moment, looking at the young princess, he said that they unfortunately are not able to predict the future. She sighed heavily as she knew they had to hurry to avoid being seen by the great sorceress. At that very moment, the emperor grabbed the young lady by the hand and pulled her towards him. He saw Lady Hellas in the distance, who was slowly walking towards him. The emperor hugged the princess tightly, hiding her behind his powerful body. The princess was a little confused because she did not understand what had happened at all. She was shocked and did not understand what the young lady was doing near her palace. Elenik knew perfectly well that the young lady was now standing in front of her castle, and she was now in the worst possible situation. At that very moment, she quietly called out to the emperor, but he squeezed her tighter and asked her to be silent. He sighed heavily and said worriedly that everything was only getting worse. Elenik looked at the emperor intently, as she realized that it would be a failure for her if he left her and went to the meeting. But looking at the emperor, she realized that something was wrong. She saw that this was not at all the look of a man looking at his future bride. The princess did not understand what he was looking at so intently, since from this angle, no one was visible except the evil witch. Elenik was agitated and did not understand what that woman was doing in the palace. She tried to loosen the emperor's grip a little, but it was all pointless. At that moment, she was taken aback and wondered why Saleha had come to them at all. She had no other idea except that she had come to meet her. At that very moment, the emperor leaned closer to her and quietly called out to her. She shuddered because he acted in such a way, and it was unexpected for her. He looked at her with a tender smile and asked if she would like to take a walk around the city. The princess was taken aback, as she did not expect such a thing, but still she was satisfied with any place where there was no evil witch. At that very moment, the young man sighed heavily and called the young lady. Lady Hella stopped when she heard the voice of the emperor's assistant. At that very moment, she turned around and looked at him with a smile. Lady Helid, looking at the secretary, called him. Felix sighed heavily and informed the young lady that the emperor had strictly forbidden entry into this area. She was taken aback and asked in surprise if this was really so. At the same moment, she asked for forgiveness since she should have been more careful. She was a little surprised, as she didn't expect him to give such an order. She was puzzled because she didn't know where he had picked up that little woman, who could die even from a tiny amount of magic. Lady Helad was a little puzzled because the emperor not only settled her in the palace, but also got rid of magical items. She could not even imagine that the young lady would last so long, but she knew that the shoots must be cut young. The lady knew that it would be problematic if a man who was already wary of her began to take active steps against her. Oh, she knew that the emperor was a man with the strongest and purest divine energy. She understood that the only woman he could marry was her. The young man looked closely at the young lady and informed her that she had nothing to apologize for, but she must still proceed to your main palace, where the emperor was already waiting for her. She smiled an innocent smile and agreed with him. But she knew it was a lie, because she couldn't believe that a man who was so concerned about his punctuality would arrive a few minutes earlier, then agreed just to wait for her. She understood perfectly well that I was being stupid, but she still followed the secretary. Looking after the young man, she asked if it was really His Majesty who said that she was here. The young man was taken aback, as he did not expect such a question, but he said that he himself decided to come, to inform her that entry to this place was prohibited. She was a little surprised by such a statement, but in turn, the young lady did not feel anything unusual. Divine energy and magic, only these forces, are capable of interacting and resisting each other. However, these forces are unable to recognize each other, which is why they have coexisted for so long. Lady Helid did not feel his divine presence, and he in turn did not feel her magic. Lady Helid, in turn, wondered where the emperor was watching her from. The emperor looked intently at the young princess and called her. He sighed heavily and asked if the young sorceress really held a grudge against her. The princess looked away from him because she didn't know what to answer. She didn't know that for sure, but she thought that the most powerful dark witch was offended at her only because she had stuck her tongue out at her once. The emperor sighed heavily and said that he had no idea what she had planned. The princess, in a panic, said that she had nothing in mind at all, because she simply wanted to take the emperor hostage for one day. Eurydion was taken aback, as he did not expect to hear anything like this. He sighed heavily and said that he was talking not about her, but about Lady Hellas. At the same moment, he asked what she had just said. She was agitated and said that she had misspoken a little. The princess understood that she should just stand still and say nothing. Elenik looked closely at the emperor and wondered what he was thinking about. At that very moment, he looked at her with a smile and asked what she was going to do. The princess looked at him in bewilderment, not knowing what to answer. Elenyeka, that he did not have the affection that a man thinking about his engagement should have. But it seemed to her that the emperor was more knowledgeable about the young lady than she had previously thought. She looked closely at the emperor and wondered if he was really going to show her the capital. She didn't know if he really wanted this, or if he just wanted to escape from the young lady. She knew that this seemed more likely, but she wondered if they would be able to make a real escape. Elenik sighed heavily and called the emperor. He looked at her in surprise, but she still decided to ask if they were really running away now. At that very moment, the emperor said that this was not so, and that they were in the process of kidnapping him by her. He sighed heavily and said that he had the impression that the kidnapper was completely incompetent at his job. The young lady was taken aback, as she hadn't expected such a thing. She didn't understand what kind of nonsense he was talking about. She saw that he was looking at her, as if he had no intention of explaining anything more to her. The emperor sighed heavily, and looking at the princess said that if she left the palace looking like that, he would immediately lose her in the capital. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand what he was talking about. At that very moment, the emperor called his subordinate. She looked at the young man in surprise as he was very fast. At that very moment, she saw a small cape in the emperor's hands. Eurydion easily wrapped up the young princess. She was taken aback and looked at him in surprise as he carefully and skillfully tied a bow on her cape. But she was a little puzzled as she found it difficult to breathe due to some of his manipulations. After a few seconds, he looked at her with a satisfied smile as he saw that it was much better this way. Elenik was a little puzzled and didn't understand why he had wrapped her up from head to toe. Of course, she was aware of the fact that going into the city could be dangerous. She also understood that it could be dangerous when a beautiful girl in such an exquisite outfit walked around the city. But looking at the emperor, she understood that if it was a question of appearance now, then he attracted more attention than she did. He smiled and asked the princess what she would like to see most. Eurydion asked the princess whether she wanted to sit in the temple or the statue of the wolf in the square, or whether she wanted to see the fresco depicting the founding of the empire. The princess thought for a moment, as she would have liked to visit the temple with pleasure, but at that very moment she was taken aback and said that she did not want to go there. The princess looked at the emperor in a hurry and asked what was wrong with him. Eurydion looked at her with a smile and said that she would never lose him. She looked at him intently, as she was after all very attractive. But at that very moment she shouted that he should stop, since she was not talking about that at all. She looked closely at the emperor and wondered if he was crazy and was going to come out with such a face in beautiful clothes. She understood that everyone in the capital would run to him. The emperor looked at her with bewilderment and asked if something was wrong. She was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. At that very moment, the princess shouted to the emperor that he should be in the same clothes as she was. He sighed heavily and said that he didn't think it was a very good idea. But Eurydion, sighing heavily, said that if she wanted it, then he would do the same. At that very moment, the princess fastened his cloak and asked him to put on his hood. Elenik said with a joyful smile that she had finished her preparations. He looked at her with bewilderment and asked if she really liked it when he was completely wrapped in a cloak. The princess looked at him intently and seriously and said that this was not so, and in general she preferred that he take everything off, but the situation now was different. The princess looked at him intently and said that she should be asking him such a question since he had tightened the bow around her neck, causing her to almost choke. He sighed heavily and said that she was amazingly naive. The princess looked at him in bewilderment as she did not understand what he was talking about. She, with a satisfied smile, informed the emperor that she knew everything she needed. He smiled after her answer and noted that everything was exactly like that. At that very moment, the emperor tenderly took the princess by the hand. She froze in place from embarrassment, but in turn was puzzled. She knew that they had already held hands many times, but for some reason now her heart was beating strongly. The emperor looked closely at his companion and said that there would be many people in the city center, especially magicians, so she should not leave his side for a step. Arriving with a smile, she said that he did not need to worry about anything because she would be next to him like glued. Elenik looked at the emperor with a satisfied smile. She understood that her plan had undergone changes, but this was all now much better than what she had planned earlier. But in turn, the young lady was a little puzzled. She did not know where all this would lead her. She took the emperor's hand with a joyful smile and asked where they were going, but at the same time she called him Mr. Prisoner. She looked intently at the emperor as she realized that nothing would happen to her if she stayed close to him. A moment later, they slowly approached the knight who had already prepared his faithful horse for them. The emperor looked tenderly at his faithful horse, as they had not seen each other for a long time, and he had time to miss him. At that very moment, the princess looked at the emperor in bewilderment as she saw the horse on which they had arrived from the kingdom. Elenika. Looking at the horse, she realized that he was not as scary as he might have seemed at their first meeting. She understood that she should learn to ride a horse at the first opportunity, but now she did not need it. But she was aware of the fact that the time would come when she would have to leave alone. The emperor looked intently at his companion and called her At that very moment, he lifted her up with ease as he intended to seat her on his faithful companion. Elenik thanked the emperor with a joyful smile and quickly grabbed her horse. Elenik was a little worried as she noticed that she was sitting really high, but she understood that she was not at all ready to ride a horse now. At that moment, the emperor looked at her and said that her posture was not quite suitable for riding. The young lady quickly realized her mistake, and at that very moment she straightened up. The emperor looked closely at his subordinate and asked him to finish the task before his return. He also said that the others should follow them quietly. The knight bowed and said that he understood everything. Elenik looked sideways at everyone present, as she did not understand why he ordered the knights to follow them. At that very moment, he spurred his horse, and they headed towards the city. The young princess in turn was happy and at the same time excited as she felt a flow of fresh air. She was glad that she was able to leave the palace, as she was able to do this for the first time since her arrival. Elenik looked closely at the wide streets that were different from the streets of the kingdom, because now she fully realized how isolated and provincial the kingdom of Lebovny was. At that very moment, she was surprised and looked around because she did not understand why people were looking at them so intently. After a few seconds, the emperor pulled the hood down onto the princess's head even more. She was puzzled because she did not understand why he was doing such a thing. She looked at him in confusion, but he told her not to take off her hood as she was attracting too much attention. Elenik sighed heavily and said that she had not taken it off at all. The emperor looked closely at his companion and said that they would soon dismount, and then she would be able to look around. At that moment, the princess sighed, as she did not want to argue with him, but in any case, she did not want to attract attention at all, so she agreed. Elenik, in turn, enjoyed the bustle of the city, as it had been a long time since she had heard such noise. She liked this change of scenery because she was too tired of worrying about all the problems. She thought that now that they were able to escape from the evil witch, she could relax a little because now she was in the safest place and the most trusted person in the world. But at that very moment, she threw all her thoughts away because the emperor suddenly got off his horse and pulled her towards him. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected this. The emperor looked intently at his companion, and at that very moment he said that when they were in public, she should watch her behavior. But at the same time, he pulled her hood even tighter. The princess screamed because she did not expect this. She looked at him with a smile as she wanted to address him as always, but he firmly said that she should not address him like that. Elenik sighed heavily, as she did not know how to address him. The emperor said that she did not have to address him in any way, because he would always be with her, and she would have no reason to call him by any name. She sighed heavily and looked closely at the emperor, because she understood that he was still the same strange iron wall. She was going to break through his wall, so she wanted to call him emperor at every opportunity. She sighed heavily as she realized that she was not a child. She should not act like this. At that very moment, the emperor said that they had gotten off their horses to look around, so they had better hurry if they wanted to see somethings. The princess smiled and said that she was very glad, as she loved to walk. She understood perfectly well that in fact the emperor was not obliged to show her the capital. She felt awkward that she forced the emperor to walk around without protection. He smiled and said that he wanted to see the capital himself, so she didn't need to make such a face. He smiled and said he needed to check something, so he asked her to keep her hood on. Elenik looked closely at the emperor. She was touched by his words, because sometimes she had the feeling that he read her thoughts. She hoped that what he said was true, because she was grateful to him for caring about her feelings. But she still saw that he was fickle. As soon as he showed her kindness and care, he would again build an iron wall around himself. And every time she approached him, he immediately hid behind the wall. The princess was puzzled, because she knew that he had an attractive face, and she could not help herself. She hoped that soon her poor heart would calm down. At that very moment, Helenika bowed and thanked the emperor for what she had done earlier. Namely, she thanked him for agreeing to be with her and to be her tonic, that is her shield. She shouted with a joyful smile that she would try to have a good and enjoyable time. Eurydion sighed heavily, and looking at the princess said that he would like her not to forget this. At that very moment, the princess shuddered at his words. She asked in surprise what he was talking about. He smiled and said that she didn't need to worry about anything, and if she enjoyed it, that would be enough. The princess was taken aback and froze in place. She wondered if he was seducing her again. Eurydion extended his hand to his companion and announced that it was time for them to leave. She was shocked because he was playing with her heart again. She realized that his face was to blame for everything. Eurydion looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand what she said. But the princess said with a joyful smile that he was indeed very handsome. The emperor did not have time to utter a word, when suddenly the princess grabbed his hand and said that it was time for him to go. She was taken aback after feeling the surge of divine energy. The princess turned away from him in embarrassment. She was a little excited because she didn't understand what was happening at all, because she felt as if her face was on fire. Some time later, they walked around the city and the emperor told his companion everything. But a few minutes later, he informed her that they had arrived at the place. The young lady was taken aback as she saw a beautiful square. She would have liked to run closer, but the emperor grabbed her hand and asked her not to go anywhere alone. She was taken aback, but still agreed. At that very moment, the emperor looked around. She looked at him closely as he was acting strangely and seemed more nervous than usual. Eurydion, looking at his companion, asked if she had heard about the square before. She smiled and said that she had. She told the emperor that she had been told earlier that this place was a must-see because it was very beautiful. Eurydion looked at her and asked who had told her this. She looked at him intently and said that she had spoken to the priest earlier, and he had said that the square was the culmination of centuries of the empire's culture and art, and that she should visit it. He sighed heavily and, looking at his companion, said that it seemed that she had become very close friends with the priest. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand why this conversation had taken a strange turn. Hellenica, looking at the emperor, asked if she really couldn't be friends with the priest. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed like she could become friends with him. The princess was a little confused. She understood that it would be strange if they did not become friends, because she spent more time with her maid and priest than with the emperor. The emperor sighed and asked if the priest had given her permission to address him by his name. At the same moment, the princess looked at him with joy and asked if he was jealous. The emperor, in turn, looked at her with bewilderment and asked if he was really jealous of someone. She sighed heavily and said that he shouldn't make that kind of expression after what he said earlier, as it would hurt her a lot after that. Elenik sighed heavily and asked why he shouldn't be jealous. She even said that she and the priest were on friendly terms, and she could call him by his first name, and she said that the priest himself didn't mind. Elenik, in truth, could not simply address him by his title, so they barely reached a compromise, and he agreed that she could call him simply by his first name, while she knew that she had a servant as a witness to what was happening. The emperor sighed heavily and said that if they had agreed on this, then nothing terrible had happened, but he still asked if she had given the priest permission to call her by her name. She sighed heavily and said that it was true, because she belonged to the royal family. He sighed heavily and said that he understood her. Elenik was agitated and did not understand what the emperor had in mind. At that very moment, she asked the emperor if he really wanted to address her by name. The emperor was taken aback, as he did not expect such a question. The princess happily gave her name and informed him that her full name was quite long, so he could address her as he liked, but she also gave him several of her abbreviated names. The emperor stood frozen in place as he did not know what to do. She smiled and said with pride that only her family could call her that, but for him she could make an exception. The emperor was taken aback and froze in place without uttering a word. He saw that she did not know that in the culture of the empire, people do not address each other by their names or even by nicknames, but only if there is a special relationship between them, they can allow themselves such liberties. He understood that the question was different, even if she knew she would not care because she was too careless. He looked at her intently and said with a gentle smile that there were many things she didn't know about the empire. The princess looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He said with a smile that she did not need to worry, and the emperor also asked if she remembered what he had told her earlier. Elenik sighed heavily as she realized that she had done something wrong again. She pouted and asked the emperor what he meant. He sighed heavily and said that she could forget what they had talked about, since it seemed he had to take care of everything himself. She looked at the emperor in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about, But more than that, she wondered why he continued to speak to her in riddles all the time. She promised, wondering if he didn't like the fact that she had become friends with the priest, who was his confidant. She understood that if this was so, then he was just petty and evil. Elenik said at the same moment that they had become closer because he had not gone out into the garden, and she also asked who had made her wait for so long outside. The emperor, in turn, coldly said that he was busy. The princess was shocked. She did not understand why it looked as if she was a spoiled child who asked a busy adult to play with him. She sighed heavily and said that she was just joking, and she was glad that he allowed himself to be stolen so that they could go out into the city. She asked if she had the right to ask him to play with her. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she quickly admitted she was wrong. The princess was angry at the emperor after such words. But at that very moment, she suddenly felt pain and froze in place. At that very moment, the emperor saw someone rush past them, but he still managed to protect his companion. A few seconds later, the young princess found herself in the emperor's arms. Elenik looked after the young man in surprise, as she noticed that he accidentally dropped a black button. But she wondered if it was an accident. But the princess also noticed that the strange stabbing feelings had already disappeared when she touched the emperor. Elenik was a little confused, as she didn't understand what had happened at all. Elenik looked at the emperor and said with a smile that the young man was very fast, and it seemed he had some urgent business, while she, smiling, thanked the emperor for saving her. The emperor looked at her with a gentle smile, but said nothing. A moment later, he sighed heavily and said that at times like these, he was very glad that she was so carefree and naive. She smiled and asked if he had just insulted her. Eurydion sighed heavily and said that this was not so, because he had previously told her that he was very glad that she was like that. She smiled and asked where in the world such a thing could be considered a compliment. The emperor looked closely at his companion, as he did not want her to worry. He said that she should not do anything that was not in keeping with her character. The princess looked at him in bewilderment. She didn't understand what was happening and wondered if she had missed something. At that very moment, she looked back, as she realized that nothing seemed to have happened. The emperor noticed that she was trembling, and after a moment, he touched her and transferred his energy to her. He looked at her with a satisfied smile, as he saw that she was already feeling better before her very eyes. He smiled and said that it was time for them to go. She nodded and agreed with him. The princess knew that the priest had told her about the square earlier. He said that it was a must-see, because this place is home to the singing, this jam of art. The square had a mosaic on the road, and a fountain with a statue of a wolf, and there were also frescoes on the walls around the square. The young princess walked around happily, and after some time, they came to a shop to get some refreshment. The emperor smiled and told the princess that instead of shashlik, she should buy cotton candy. She puffed out her beautiful cheeks and asked if he was making fun of her. The emperor sighed heavily, and with a gentle smile, asked if she didn't like her beautiful hair. She looked away from him, embarrassed, and said that it wasn't that she just didn't want him to compare her to Hellas, since she was a truly exquisite beauty. The young princess, out of anger, devoured the shashlik and told the emperor that she did not eat cotton candy at all, so he could buy something else. He smiled and said that he would do everything as she wanted. At that very moment, the emperor closely watched everything that was around and unnoticed by the princess. He destroyed all obstacles in their path. The princess looked at the emperor with a displeased expression on her face, as she saw that he was simply answering all her questions with prepared phrases. Elenik saw that for some time now, he had been focused not on their walk, but on something else. A moment later, the emperor said that he would like her to hold his purse. The princess was taken aback, as she had not asked him to do this at all. She shouted that he did not need to do this, as she was not a child. Elenik looked away and told the emperor that the wolf had a cross on his back. He asked in bewilderment what she was talking about. Elenika said that she was talking about the wolf statue now, since she had not noticed anything like it before. But as soon as they got closer, she immediately noticed a cross on its back. The emperor sighed heavily and said that the wolf and the cross were the symbol of the empire. After all, Raulis, the god of peace and prosperity, took the form of a wolf when he descended to earth, and the wolf symbolized the imperial family, and the cross symbolized the strong faith in the representative of the imperial family. She sighed heavily and said that she understood everything, but at the same time, she again called him Lord Father. He sighed heavily, because he understood that she was simply incorrigible. Elenik looked at the emperor with a joyful smile and said that it seemed that this was his symbol. She saw that the emperor was now looking at her intently, without looking away. She also stared at him as she noticed that he looked normal again. She wondered if she had just imagined that he had a distracted look earlier. Eurydion looked at her with a smile and asked why she was looking at him so intently. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked how she was looking at him. He smiled and said that it seemed to him as if she was studying him. Elenik was taken aback and said that this was not so, but at the same time she looked away from him with an indignant look. Elenik smiled and said that when she looked at you with a normal gaze, it meant that she was going to do something unexpected. She sighed heavily as she realized that in his eyes, she was a problem with pink cotton wool on her head. Elenik said casually that in another situation this might be the case, but now she looked like that because she felt like she was being neglected. He looked at her with a smile and said that these were unfounded accusations. At that very moment, the emperor took her hand in a friendly manner. He said that, if it seemed that way to her, then that was how it was. But he also asked what else she would like to see. The young princess in turn was offended, but she looked at him intently. She smiled a happy smile and said that she would like to take a closer look at the wolf statue. He was captivated by her smile and so quickly agreed. She saw that he was now looking only at her. The princess understood that even if it was not for long, she was still happy. A moment later, she was happily leading him by the hand to the statue. The emperor, in turn, was immersed in his thoughts. He could not get that inconspicuous stone out of his head. At that very moment, he was taken aback, for he saw a beautiful princess who joyfully told him that he should look at the beautiful statue. She said that this was the perfect place for Togo to take photographs. She smiled and said that the wolf would fit perfectly into the frame, but a moment later, the princess was taken aback as she remembered that there were no cameras here. He looked at her intently, as if he knew he had to find out everything upon returning to the palace. At the same time, the princess smiled and shouted that her kingdom was very different from the empire, since they did not have such large areas. Elenik admired the view with admiration and said that everything in the kingdom was very small, the palaces, houses, and even the squares. At that very moment, she looked at the emperor and said that he had seen their palace, and he must have noticed that compared to the imperial palace, their palace was very small. He smiled and said that her country was the size of a fingernail. She was taken aback and said that this was not entirely true, and that it was not about her kingdom at all, but about the fact that the empire was too big. He sighed heavily and said that he agreed with her. The princess was offended again and said that his words really did hurt her. At the same time, the emperor turned his attention to another inconspicuous stone that was near his feet. He had never seen a black vortex stone before, but today, for some reason, he kept bumping into them. He wondered if they were somehow connected to her black magic. At that very moment, he was distracted as the young lady happily pulled him to another place. The emperor knew that this stone could be used in many ways. One could store things in them or use the contents of the stone for one's own benefit. He was excited because he knew that earlier the young lady appeared in front of the princess's palace. Then, as soon as they left the palace, black stones began to appear on their way. He also noticed a magician who seemed to accidentally stumble upon them, but he understood that this was only circumstantial evidence. After all, no matter how sensitive he was to mana, he could not notice everything, especially if his opponent was a mage. The emperor understood that things became more complicated when the magicians had strong connections with their god, and it became much more difficult to detect them when there was a crowd of people around them. He was a little puzzled and alarmed, as he did not understand what was causing the disgusting feeling in him. At that very moment, he again heard the crack of the stone, which was slowly rolling towards the princess. He realized that this was enough to confirm his intentions. In the end, he still did not know whose side the gloomy woman was on. He didn't know who was going to kidnap whom, but at that very moment, all his thoughts disappeared when the young princess called out to him in bewilderment. She was alarmed and did not understand why he had such an expression on his face. But he easily caught her and told her to be careful, and the small stone rolled further and did not hit the princess. She looked at him in bewilderment and the emperor in turn watched the stone intently. He sighed heavily and said that he had asked earlier not to call him emperor in public. The emperor also asked her to look where she was going. The princess turned around and said with surprise that there was nothing ahead. A moment later, the emperor asked his companion where else she would like to go. He also said that they forgot to visit the jewelry shops, so he asked if she would like to head there immediately. The princess happily said that she would like to go. Some time later, the princess looked with joy at the various decorations offered. She chose a hairpin, and the seller told her that she should take off the hood to see how the pin would look on her hair. She joyfully reached for the hood because she wanted to take it off quickly, but the emperor intercepted her hand and forbade her to take off the hood. She was taken aback in a way she hadn't expected. He looked at her closely, knowing that her pink hair was rare in the empire, and that she might attract unwanted attention. The princess looked intently at the emperor, and with burning eyes asked him to give in to her for just a second, but he firmly refused. She was taken aback and said that then she would not be able to say what suited her and what did not. The emperor quietly said that he would order everything to be delivered to the palace so she could keep her hood on. The princess was shocked and screamed that it was too much of him. The emperor smiled and said that everything was fine because he was the richest man in the empire, and the saleswoman was very happy. The princess knew it was true, but she felt uneasy somehow. After a moment, she smiled and said that he was right, and money was made to be spent. He looked at her with bewilderment, because he did not understand what she was thinking, since she very quickly convinced herself otherwise. A moment later, the young princess turned around, wanting to look at the other stones. She looked closely at the small stone, as it looked similar to the one that had rolled past earlier. She was taken aback as she felt a strange feeling. At that very moment, the princess unconsciously pulled herself towards the stone. Elenik was puzzled and did not understand what was happening at all, as she as if enchanted was drawn to the stone. But a moment after touching the stone, she screamed. The emperor looked at her in bewilderment, and the princess shouted to him that the stone was very strange. Elenik pointed out a small stone to the emperor. She was in shock. She didn't understand what was happening at all, since she didn't want to touch him at all, but her hand was reaching out to him. She had the feeling that the stone was attracting her. At that very moment, the emperor grabbed her and hugged her, and also shouted at her not to touch the stone. He sighed heavily and said that they would continue to encounter strange things along the way. Elenik was taken aback as she realized that this time she was not mistaken. She noticed that the atmosphere had changed very dramatically. At that very moment, she noticed that the emperor reached out to the stone and took it with his bare hands. She could not stand it and shouted at him not to touch the stone, but at that very moment, she was taken aback and froze in shock on the spot as she saw that he simply took the stone and nothing happened to it. She turned her gaze to her finger, which was injured. A moment later, the emperor simply crushed the stone in his hand. The princess looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect this. Elenik was taken aback when he took her hand. She was very excited and did not understand what had happened when she touched the stone. At that very moment, the emperor used his magic, and with its help, he was able to heal the princess. At that very moment, he called his knights. The princess was a little surprised. Elenik glanced around the corner, realizing that the man next to the horse was one of the emperor's knights. She was taken aback as she realized that the emperor had been waiting for something from the very beginning, so he ordered the knights to follow them. A moment later, the emperor told the princess that they had better leave the square. She was surprised as she did not expect such a thing. He immediately said that today he saw a lot of rats in the square. The princess was taken aback and hoped that he was not talking about real rats. At that moment, she froze in place and wondered if the evil witch had been watching them all this time. Out of fear, Elenik suddenly turned to the emperor and hugged him tightly. He sighed heavily and asked the princess what her actions meant. Without looking up at him, she said that it meant that she liked him. Elenik was puzzled, as this had become a bad habit of hers. She understood that she could not rely on him so often. Her body responded to him instinctively because she could draw energy from him. Still, the princess realized that she had to let him go, but she did it reluctantly. A moment later, she looked at the emperor with a joyful smile as her body and mind were charged with fresh energy. She announced that they could now set off. The emperor looked at his subordinates and told them to surround the square. And he also asked one of the knights to contact the magic tower. The princess froze for a moment as she heard his cold voice. She looked around as if she didn't understand where the knights were, but after a few seconds, she was taken aback as he suddenly picked her up in his arms. The emperor looked at his companion with a sly smile and said that she had previously said that she would like to visit the temple. The princess consoled her, as she did not expect such a thing. At that very moment, she remembered their recent conversation about the temple, but she came to her senses as she knew that it was not important now. Elenik gave the emperor a tight hug and asked why they didn't stop there and return to the palace. But the emperor was not going to listen to her. He quickly put her on a horse and they moved to the temple. She was in shock as they moved very fast. After some time, they rushed to the temple. At that very moment, the priest told them to stop immediately since they could not enter the temple grounds on horseback. But at that very moment, the emperor took off his hood and told the priest to get out of the way immediately. The priest hesitated, not knowing what to do in this situation. He looked at the emperor in surprise and asked who was next to him. The emperor, in turn, coldly told the young man that he did not need to know. Elenik was taken aback, as she had never heard the emperor speak so rudely before. She looked at the priest in bewilderment, as she did not understand why everything was this way. The emperor sighed heavily and told the priest that the young lady was his guest and that she was under the protection of the empire. At that very moment, the priest asked the young princess for forgiveness, because he, not knowing this fact, had been very disrespectful to her and groups. She smiled and said that everything was fine and he did not need to worry. But a moment later, they were already on the temple grounds. She looked at the emperor in surprise and asked why he was in such a hurry since they could have gone a little slower. The emperor asked if everything was okay with her. The princess looked at him in surprise as she did not expect such a question, but said that everything was fine with her. Eurydion looked closely at the princess and asked if this was true. She was a little worried and didn't understand why he was behaving this way. But a few seconds after she entered the temple grounds, she was filled with energy. This situation was unexpected for the princess, and she involuntarily staggered, after which she fell into both the emperor's arms. He sighed heavily, looking at his companion, as he had previously assumed that something like this could happen. Eurydion tenderly told the princess to take a deep breath and exhale. He knew that everyone who came to their temple for the first time had encountered something similar. She was shocked because she felt a huge amount of divine energy on herself. The emperor looked closely at his companion and asked her to breathe. She did as he told her, but she did not feel very well. A moment later, the young princess was taken aback as she felt a fresh flow of energy. She was a little agitated as everything was very strange, and she came to her senses very quickly. Eurydion informed the princess that these lands were filled with pure divine energy, and he asked if she could move. She sighed heavily and said that she could go freely. At that very moment, the emperor removed her hood and asked if she was hot. The princess sheepishly adjusted her hair and said that she was a little hot, but she also informed him that she was fine and that he should not worry. At that very moment, she was taken aback and looked at the emperor as if enchanted. Elenik involuntarily shuddered as the emperor moved closer to her. She turned her embarrassed gaze away from him, as she was very embarrassed when he looked at her with such a gaze. At that very moment, she embarrassedly asked the emperor what he was doing at all, and a moment later he showed her her own hand. Elenik was a little surprised, and at the same time puzzled since her hand was completely healed. She sighed heavily as she realized he wasn't listening to her, and with that, she decided to give in and let him look at her. Eurydion let go of the princess's hand and said that before they left, he should have strictly forbidden her to touch suspicious things. She was taken aback and cried out that she had not touched the stone because she wanted to. Elenik screamed because she was outraged by the fact that the stone was attracting her. The princess said that the stone wanted her to touch it. The emperor looked at the princess with a smile and said that she was right, since this was quite possible. She became agitated and asked irritably if he really believed hers. The emperor smiled and said that he believed her. She sighed heavily because she saw that his face spoke for itself, that he did not believe her. Elenik was angry because he treated her like a child. He smiled and asked if she had really said that this stone attracted her. She was taken aback because she noticed that today he was not like usual. At that very moment, she rushed to him, but he told her to go to the temple immediately. Eurydion said with a smile that her friend should be there in the temple now, so she would not be so lonely. Helenica was shocked by his words and asked how he was, since she hoped that he would be with her all day. But at that very moment, the emperor said that he had to check something. She grabbed his cloak tighter and asked where he was going, calling him a prisoner. The emperor looked at her in bewilderment, as he did not expect such a thing. Elenik was very angry and worried, because she didn't know what he was going to check. She shouted that he had been acting strange all day today. Elenik said she found it suspicious when he suddenly wanted to leave the square, and the way he kept looking around was also strange. She screamed that even his face looked strange, and even his eyes. She was sure that from the moment they left the palace, the emperor had already been on guard. She knew that he had not been so excited, even when she told him that she was kidnapping him. Elenik looked timidly at the emperor and asked if he really suspected that Saleha Hellas was involved. He looked at the princess with a smile and said that he had never seen such a serious expression on her face before. The emperor smiled and said that in such situations she was quite perceptive, but usually she was careless and inattentive. Elenik looked at the emperor with a displeased expression on her face, as she was serious when it was necessary. He looked at her tenderly and said that when they were in the square, he saw several things that were forbidden in the city. He had not seen anything like this for a long time, so he wanted to investigate. He informed the princess that the stone she had almost touched was one of those forbidden things. He sighed and said that there were quite a few of them, so it would be dangerous for her to go with him, and she would not be able to return to the palace without him either. So he wanted her to stay in the temple for her own safety. She sighed heavily, as he did not suspect the young lady at all, but she understood that it was all her doing. But unfortunately, the princess knew that she had no evidence against the evil witch. To her regret, she could not move freely, and she could not tell the temperature that his future spouse was a dark witch. Elenik was puzzled because she had no special skills that would help her catch the evil witch, so she understood that it was best to listen to the emperor. She was upset because she realized that she could not help him in any way, and this irritated her very much. At that very moment, she asked the emperor when he would return. Finally, he gave her a gentle smile and said that he would come back for her today. Elenik sighed heavily and asked the emperor not to delay. He smiled and said that he would return to her as quickly as possible. Elenik looked closely at the emperor and said that she was saying this in all seriousness because there was something that he did not know, so she was very worried and hoped that he would keep his promise so that she would not worry. Eurydion looked at the princess with a smile and asked what he didn't know. She looked at the emperor intently, as she knew that he knew nothing about his upcoming future. But unfortunately, she could not tell him anything. She herself didn't know when the evil witch would start acting. She wondered what if it was all an accident, and the evil witch didn't want their son to kill his father. She sighed heavily and asked the emperor to be careful, as she did not want him to get hurt by accident. Eurydion touched her tenderly and said that she seemed to be worrying too much. She looked at the emperor intently, but did not answer. She really wanted the emperor to feel at least a part of what he was worried about in her heart. She stared after him for a moment, but at the same time, the young princess felt like an abandoned kitten because she was all alone. She turned around because she remembered that the emperor had said that the priest was in the temple. She understood that she would feel better with him than alone. But at that very moment, she realized that there was one big problem. Elenika Princess was in shock because she didn't know how to get to the very top since she was wearing heels, and there were a lot of steps. She sighed heavily as she realized that the emperor would return before she reached the top. But still, she knew that she simply had no choice, and so she confidently stepped forward. But after walking a few steps, she heard a familiar voice. At that very moment, she quickly turned around. Dirigo looked at the princess in surprise, as he now understood why the emperor was looking for him. He was a little puzzled, as he did not understand what the princess was doing in the temple. The princess was very glad to see him, as she understood that she would not have to go up to him. Some time later, they were leisurely walking to the temple, and the young man informed the princess that only those who had offered themselves to the god could climb this staircase, since at the top was the temple of Raulis. Dirigo smiled and said that since the god himself had climbed this staircase, ordinary people were forbidden to walk on it. The princess was shocked by this information and did not understand why the emperor did not tell her about such an important detail. She understood that if it were not for her friend who told her this information, she would have offered herself to God and become a nun. She was puzzled, as she had misunderstood everything, because the emperor left her near the steps to the temple. She sighed heavily and asked her friend how he knew she was there. He smiled and said that the emperor had told him about it. She was amazed when she heard something like this, because she did not know how he managed to do this, because the princess was sure that he was next to her all this time. Dirigo Takoi said that the priests could communicate with each other without words. Among them, all the emperor had the strongest and purest divine energy, so he could easily transmit information to others at a distance. The princess froze in place from the slag, as this was very useful information. She realized that at that moment in the square, he was not talking to himself, but giving orders to other people. Dirigo looked at the princess with a smile and asked how she was feeling. She smiled and said that she felt wonderful and that she had not felt so rested for a long time. But she knew that all the pure energy was too much for her. But unfortunately, she no longer knew what was bad and what was good. Dirigo sighed heavily and told the princess that it was probably not entirely comfortable for her to be on the temple grounds, as she had to be on guard at all times. He also informed her that there were many places on the temple grounds that she was forbidden to enter, so she had to be careful. The princess smiled and said that she understood everything and would be careful. She thought that he most likely assumed that she would now start running around the temple grounds out of boredom. Before the princess found out that he was the head priest, he was her exclusive guide. But now everything had changed, and so she sheepishly, and with an innocent smile, asked the priest for forgiveness, because he was a very busy man, and she was causing him a lot of trouble. He smiled and said that she did not need to apologize. And at the same moment, he said that he was not such a busy man. She looked at his companion intently, for she knew that he was very kind, and in turn, she very much wanted the emperor to be as kind as the priest. She understood that if she had said such words to the emperor, he would have said mockingly that it was very strange that she had noticed that he was kind. She sighed heavily and looked away, as she found it very strange that she was thinking about him again. But unfortunately, she knew that she was tormented by doubts. She knew that even though the emperor denied it, she was sure that he was hiding something from her. She didn't know how he actually found out that the young lady was using black magic back then. Elenik sighed as her head began to split from such thoughts. At that very moment, the young man called her and informed her that golden chains surrounded the priest's prayer room, and entry there was temporarily prohibited. He smiled and said that the prayer room, for all the other people, was surrounded by beautiful chains, and both prayer rooms were next to each other. She looked at him in surprise but still agreed. Elenik immediately remembered that the mall areas for outsiders were surrounded by gold chains, and for priests by red ones. But in turn, she got everything mixed up. A moment later, the young man showed her the place where all the believers gathered. The princess was taken aback, and standing next to the priest, said that it seemed that many aristocrats also visited the place given to them. The young man smiled and said that this was true, because on the temple grounds there was only one place where people could directly address God. He smiled and said that in the temple, people were not divided according to titles and origins. Commoners and aristocrats were all together. Looking around, he noticed that there were a lot of people today. In turn, the princess saw how the young ladies were whispering about her. She was a little puzzled because she didn't understand why they suddenly started whispering and staring at her. She quickly pulled her hood up, as she hated being the center of attention. She knew that if the emperor were next to her here, and now, he would hide her. Dirigo, after some time, he brought the prince and the wasp into his private office. He smiled and said that he would like to take her to other places. But today there were more people in the temple than usual. He said that if she did not mind, she could stay in his office. At that very moment, the young princess thanked her friend, and he, with a smile, offered her a cup of tea. She sighed heavily, because all this time, while she was walking in the hood, she thought that she would die from the heat. Dirigo, looking at the princess, asked if she had really gone somewhere with the emperor. She smiled and said that they had been walking around the city with the emperor today, but then something unexpected had happened. The young man was worried and asked the princess in surprise if the emperor had really accompanied her personally. She smiled and said that it was just like that, and it all happened by pure chance. Dirigo, looking at the princess, said that when the emperor contacted him earlier, he thought something had happened, but now he was glad that she was okay. She smiled and said that nothing had happened, but it seemed to her that the emperor was worried about something. A moment later, she smiled and complimented him on his excellent tea. Dirigo looked at his companion with a satisfied smile and said that the emperor looked after her very much. The princess, in turn, was taken aback by such a statement. She did not expect this. After collecting her thoughts, after choking, she asked her friend who told him this. The young man looked at her in surprise, as he had heard the rumors that were circulating around the capital. The princess was shocked by what she heard. Dirigo smiled and said that he did not know the details, but that was what he had heard from the aristocrats who came to the temple. At that very moment, her face changed, and she asked what rumors they were talking about. He sighed heavily and said that these rumors about the princess's preferential relationship with the emperor. She asked in surprise whether these were good rumors or bad. The young man bought it and said that, unfortunately, he did not go into details. The princess said that if these were rumors that there was something between her and the emperor, then these were good rumors. But if they were about a strange girl currently living in the palace, then these were bad rumors. Looking at the young man, she asked which of the above he meant by rumors. He hesitated, not knowing how to answer, since the noblewomen said that they heard the emperor kidnap the princess and lock her in a dungeon to teach the kingdom a lesson. But some said that such a thing simply could not be true, since they saw the princess free in the palace. Some heard that the princess and the emperor had true love. They were glad that they were together, because the ladies knew that whoever the princess was, she was still better than snakes. He sighed heavily, because he told everything about the princess, and she in turn, with a joyful smile, said that these were good rumors. Elenik didn't know who and when spread such rumors, but they only played into her hands. She looked at her friend with a smile and asked if this meant that she had a chance. He looked at her with bewilderment, as he did not understand what she was talking about. She smiled and asked if there was a chance that everything would be fine between her and the emperor. The young man was taken aback, as he did not expect such a question. Elenik hesitated and said that, given the state of her body, she thought the best option for her would be to be near the emperor. He smiled and said that she did not need to worry so much, because if she ever felt bad, she could always come to their temple. The princess said that this was so, but she was not a priest and would always be a burden to them. Elenik smiled timidly and said that, moreover, people should not use the temple for selfish purposes. The young man was taken aback and said in confusion that perhaps that was true, but he did not understand why she did not talk to the emperor if she felt so bad. She smiled and told her friend not to worry. She said shyly that she enjoyed being near the emperor. So looking at our new friend, she said that she had a favor to ask of him. Helenica asked the priest if he could help her. She wanted him to help her make the emperor see her in a new light. She looked at the priest intently and said that he needed to know how important it was for her to see that her life was in danger. She understood perfectly well that she had partly lied to him because not only her life, but also the life of the emperor was under threat. The young man, in turn, looked away. He did not know how to answer her, but she looked at him persistently and mentally asked him to help hers. Dirigo looked at her with a smile and said that he thought she didn't need his help, but he would do everything in his power. She looked at him with a joyful smile as she was pleased with the answer. At that very moment, she extended her hand to him with a smile and said that they could shake hands since they were now partners in crime. Dirigo took her hand with a smile, and the princess in turn looked at him with a joyful smile because she understood that he was Cupid and a messenger of love. He smiled and told the princess that he didn't think she needed his help at all, since as far as he could see, the emperor treated her well anyway. She looked at him in surprise, but immediately said that it was all because she was a prisoner and belonged to the royal family. Dirigo looked away with a smile and said that he didn't think that was the issue, but the princess wondered if the emperor had really had time to start treating her differently. Helenica sighed heavily and said that she didn't think there was anything else. He sighed heavily and said that he didn't agree with her on this issue, because he had already told her earlier that the emperor had built an iron wall around himself. Elenik sighed heavily and said that this was true, and she herself had encountered this more than once. Elenik knew very well that the emperor was very kind, But behind the Great Wall, he hid and fenced himself off from everyone else. She knew that he was a wonderful ruler, but he had problems with communication and practically no friends. The priest smiled and said that he had been serving the emperor for many years, and there were still lines in their relationship that he could not cross. Priya looked at the priest in surprise and asked if this was true. Dirigo said that the emperor is the only representative of the imperial family, so he has a huge responsibility on his shoulders, and he is used to keeping this wall around himself, so it is extremely difficult to break through. She sighed heavily and said that she understood that. At that very moment, the young man looking at the beautiful princess said that the emperor still needed a person like the princess. She was taken aback and looked at him in surprise. But Diego said that the emperor needed a man who would take care of him, a man next to whom he could relax and rest. He looked at the princess with a smile and said that for this reason, she did not need to worry because everything was going well for her. She sighed heavily, as she did not think that she played any important role in the life of the emperor. He smiled and said that he was very glad that she had managed to spend the day in the city today. Elenika joyfully said that she was very interested, because this was the first time she had left the palace since she arrived in the empire. He smiled and asked if she had visited the square. Elenik said with joy that this square was very beautiful and lively. After a short conversation, the young man asked the princess for forgiveness, but he needed to conduct the evening service. Looking at the princess, he said that he would have invited her to join him, but he noticed that she looked very tired. The princess laughed, but did not answer. A moment later, she said she would stay in the office for a while. As he left, he smiled and said that she could rest, and that he would return in a few hours. She smiled and thanked him for his concern. Dirigo said with a smile that if something happened, or she just got bored, she could come to the closed prayer room, because he assumed that she would find it interesting there. She looked at him with a smile, but didn't answer. At that very moment, the young princess looked out the window and noticed that it was already evening. She sighed heavily, knowing that the emperor had left only a few hours ago. But despite the bright sun, she felt empty inside. She had been holding his hand all day, and now her hand felt incredibly cold. She remembered her new friend saying that the emperor needed a person like her. She didn't know if it was true that the emperor felt free around her, but she wanted to know what he really felt for her. She understood that she couldn't confirm her comrade's words when the emperor was constantly hiding behind an iron wall. Elenik sighed heavily and decided to lie down and rest for a bit. She knew that this way the emperor would arrive faster. She slowly closed her eyes as she felt the silence and tranquility in the temple, but at the same time, she really wanted the emperor to be next to her. At the same time in Udeta, the boundary between heaven and earth, the young man felt something strange that was in his temple. He felt a small and weak and completely different energy, and at the same time, he found it very interesting. After some time, the young lady opened her eyes, realizing that she had been sleeping for a very long time. Looking out the window, she noticed that the sun had already set. Elenik slowly walked up and lit a candle. She was a little puzzled, as her friend had left for work a long time ago, and still hadn't returned. She knew she had a few more minutes before he returned, so she wondered what she should do before he arrived. She did not know whether she should wait for him or go to the prayer room. At that moment, she decided to go to the prayer room. Elenik sighed heavily, as she knew that, since she had already been in the temple, Toma could visit the prayer room. She slowly walked up to the mirror and looked at her appearance, after which she decided to undo her braid. Sometime later, she went outside. Elenik was a little puzzled, because when she looked around, she saw that there was no one there. She involuntarily got the impression that she was the only living person in this temple area. But a moment later, she stopped in place as she heard some kind of rumble. With the speed of lightning, the princess turned around, as she did not understand what sound she had heard. She looked at the building and felt the darkness. She knew that there was no one here except her. At that very moment, goosebumps ran through her body as she became very scared. So she decided to pretend that she had not heard any sound, and at that very moment hurried to the prayer room. She was worried because, to her regret, she could not find the prayer room. The princess shuddered when she heard the same sound again. But a moment later, she froze in place in shock as she heard someone's voice. She turned around with lightning speed because she didn't understand what had happened at all. She wondered if someone was talking in her head. At that very moment, she clearly heard a voice telling her to come closer. She was taken aback and wondered if she had gone crazy. Elenik smiled hysterically and said that she thought she heard a dash. She quickly hid, hoping that everything would soon pass. At that very moment, she quickly ran out of the temple, but again heard a voice asking if she was really not coming. The princess was shocked because she did not imagine it and everything was real. She ran in a hurry because she wanted to find the prayer room that the priest had told her about earlier. But at that very moment, she heard a voice in her head as if he was directing her. But she screamed that she could not hear him at all. A moment later, she saw the door and realized that she had come to the right place. She wanted to shout to the priest and tell him that something strange was happening in the temple. But when she ran into the prayer room, she froze in place as there was no one in the room. Elenik was taken aback and wondered if the prayer had already ended. But after a few seconds, she realized that she had entered the wrong room. She quickly looked at the door, but heard something slam. At that very moment, she clearly heard someone else's voice in her head, asking where she was going. The princess ran to the door in a hurry and began to pull it, but it did not open. She was scared and shocked because she did not understand why everything was happening to her. At that very moment, she heard a voice. The young man said that she was very charming, but at the same time stupid. He smiled and said that she should come to him, and at the same time, he called her a rejected child of the earth. He asked if all children were as fearless as she, and at the same moment, he noticed that his child was also very lively. The princess was puzzled and worried. She did not understand who he was. At the same moment, he said that she should come closer to him, and he would not touch her. He just wanted to talk a little. Elenik was taken aback and sighed heavily because it seemed to her that she looked stupid since she was talking to emptiness, but she was sure that she heard a voice in her head. She immediately said that if he was a ghost, he should go away, and if he was a person, then she was ready to talk. He was furious and didn't understand how she dared to call him a ghost. He knew she had no idea what she was saying. He said that if she didn't come to him, he would come to her, but he just thought that she wouldn't be so scared if she came to him herself. The princess was taken aback and shouted that she was not afraid of him at all and that she could approach him herself. She froze in place for a moment as she felt a pure and soft energy that reminded her of the emperor's energy. She understood that this was a temple and nothing would harm her here. That's why she decided to approach the statue. He sighed heavily as he had put in a lot of effort, and all for the sake of seeing her face. She sighed heavily and, trembling with fear, said that she didn't know what he was like, but she knew that it was a crime. Elenik looked closely at the statue and said that he had locked the man in a room and refused to reveal himself. She said that this was not the way to do things. He smiled and said that he had previously assumed that she was timid, but it seemed he was wrong. He sighed heavily and said that he had never seen a person with a soul separate from the body. He did not understand where it came from. The young lady shuddered and froze in place after his words. She wondered if he was talking about the real her.